Hello, Notre Dame fans. Welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. That's Ryan Roberts. I'm Brian Driscoll. It's Friday, and that means, Ryan, it is prediction time. We are going to kind of put our final little bow on the Notre Dame Clemson game, talk about the magnitude of it again, talk about the recruiting weekend at hand. Then we'll kind of make our predictions and talk about how we think the game is going to go, how we think the game should go. And then we'll obviously give our predictions. I'll share with you the predictions of the entire Irish Breakdown staff. We are actually split this week, 3-3. We had 3 people pick Notre Dame, me, you, and we're going to do a little teaser. Me, Ryan, and Sean Davis all picked Notre Dame. Vince, Sean, and Andrew all picked Clemson. So we'll talk about that. And then there's a lot of other games we're going to get into this weekend, Ryan. For sure, obviously the people have questions about some games, but for sure we're going to talk about Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, LSU, Texas, Kansas State, Wake, NC State, Oregon State, Washington, Florida, Texas A&M, Baylor, Oklahoma, Syracuse, Pitt, and Florida State, Miami, and we'll probably get into a few more, Ryan. But the big game this weekend for IB Nation, and really a game that's going to look, we can talk about LSU and Georgia. LSU and Bama and Georgia and Tennessee, and those games obviously have a much bigger impact on the national championship landscape for 3 of those 4 teams involved in that. But this is one of those games where, there's championship hopes on the line for one team, and then the other team is just looking to kind of salvage their season and finish on a strong note. But for Notre Dame specifically, this is a huge opportunity for Notre Dame because it's like if you're not going to be a championship program, and Notre Dame is not going to make the college football playoff this year, obviously, can you have a say in it? And that's going to be the interesting thing because over the next month, Notre Dame could have a legitimate opportunity to knock out 2 playoff caliber teams. USC has to still play UCLA the week before they play Notre Dame. So, for all we know, they may get knocked out before they play Notre Dame. But, barring an upset, you look at USC's schedule the rest of the way, Ryan, and, they've got Cal this weekend at home. They've got Colorado at home. And then they play UCLA. They play Colorado on a Friday night. Then they play UCLA the week before that they play Notre Dame. So there's a chance there for Notre Dame to knock them out if they're able to handle their business. So that's what's at stake for Notre Dame is you can still put your prints on the college football playoff this year by what you do on the football field. And that's kind of what's in front of Notre Dame. And obviously Clemson is step 1. And on top of that, Ryan, huge recruiting weekend for Notre Dame.
Yeah, it's massive. And I think that when you look at it from all angles, Brian, like short term, long term, there's a lot riding on this game for Notre Dame. You're a top 5 matchup, playing a top 5 team in your home stadium, a place where you haven't played particularly well this year. You get to play against a team that has been one of the top of college football for the last X amount of years. The last time you played them in the regular season, in 2020, they obviously came out with a victory, but there was a little bit of an asterisk next to that game, right? Because Trevor Lawrence didn't play, Tyler Davis didn't play. There were a couple key contributors didn't play. Yeah, Mike Jones, they didn't play in that football game. This game, there's no excuse for Clemson in this one, right? Like they're healthy. They're healthy.
Right.
Or Notre Dame. Well, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's no asterisk next to this game. There's no but next to this game. Notre Dame has a gigantic opportunity to not only beat a top 5 team on national television, to be able to show that there's progress, but also the long-term implications, Brian, is that hey, in order to be that team near the top, of course you need to beat the bad teams on your schedule or the underwhelming teams on your schedule, but you also need to beat those top dogs, right? And Clemson's been a top dog, so short-term, long-term, a lot of implication in this game, a lot of opportunities for Notre Dame. And like you said, even with a couple cancellations from a couple recruits that we just got wind of this morning, you're still looking at 60-plus recruits that are going to be on campus this weekend from the 2023, 2024, 2025, and even 2026 recruiting classes. So getting that opportunity in front of them on the sideline, in the stands, to show to these recruits where this program is heading. Not only is it a big game for the current players, the current staff, all the Notre Dame fans out there and supporters, it's also huge for the future of Notre Dame football. So just a tremendous opportunity for Notre Dame Saturday night, 7:30 Eastern.
Big one, big one, big one. I can't wait. I'm going to be there, so very excited about that. We're going to be tailgating this weekend at Irish Breakdown. We're going to be in stadium lot, so we're going to be right in front of the stadium. Had somebody step up big last night because we were actually contemplating, maybe not be able to do it because we just have like one tent, and if it's going to be raining, I mean, there's no way to have the food and all of us and people there. So it was just kind of like, it's going to stink. So we had somebody step up last night and offer us our chance to kind of hang out with them. At their place, we'll have the IB flag hanging over by the tent, but it's going to be 4 tents kind of stacked up there. So we'll have the food there. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a big, 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 big weekend, Ryan. We've talked all week about what's at stake here, right? Notre Dame has a chance to, gain momentum. They have a chance to have a big win over a top team, second win over its third win over a big, one of the better ACC teams. You could make a case that if they beat Clemson, they will have beat 3 of the top 3 teams in the ACC. I would say at least 3 of the top 4. I mean, 3 of the top 5, I should say. I think that Wake Forest still deserves conversation here, depending on how the season plays out. Right? You could argue that maybe if Florida State gets hot down the stretch, they might be in that conversation. But I think for certain right now, NC State, if they can rally back after losing Devin Leary, they haven't looked great since he's gone down. We'll talk about that later, but I think for sure Clemson, North Carolina right now are the cream of the crop in the ACC. And then Syracuse is obviously in that conversation as well, and we'll see how they handle Pitt today. We'll talk about that game as well. But a lot at stake for both teams. Right now Clemson's a team that a lot of people don't believe in. They think they're overrated. They're not, they're banking on past, what they've been in the past, which is kind of funny because I'm like, isn't that same reason Alabama's 6th, right? I mean, isn't that true for several people right now? But this is a chance for Clemson to go on the road against a quality Notre Dame team and show that they're a top 4 team. And this is a chance for Notre Dame to say, hey, that team we were against Marshall and Stanford, that's not us. We're the team that you saw against Pitt, against Syracuse and North Carolina. That's really what this game comes down to for Notre Dame, right, as far as what's at stake. Who are you? Right. I mean, that's the question. Who are you as a team? We don't know yet. Did you just happen to have a couple good games where your talent shined through in spite of other things, and that's why you beat Syracuse and North Carolina? Right now, that's who Notre Dame is, right? I mean, because they've had more games than they've had good games, and so. But this game is the thing where if you're able to win this game, Ryan, you put a lot of that behind you. Doesn't go away, as we said. They put it behind you, and you say, okay. Now they're playing like the team we thought they could be, and you can kind of go into the rest of the month of November with a lot of momentum. So that's what's really exciting about this. The night game adds something to it. The big recruiting game adds something to it. I'm excited about this, and it's time. As we get ready to give our predictions and how we see the game going out, playing out. Those are the things I get excited about. Marcus Freeman said this is what you come to Notre Dame for, and what I would say is this is why I love covering Notre Dame. It's for games like this, and honestly. You know what I like about this schedule this year? It's just there's more games like this on it. Where last year's kind of like Cincinnati and then what else? Before the season, we were like, Wisconsin's not as good as people think. North Carolina's not going to be as good as people think. USC's not good. It's just kind of like Cincinnati and what else? 2020 was set up to be a really fun year, and then the COVID stuff shook up that schedule and ended up not being a really good schedule outside of Clemson. And then nobody could be there for it. 2019 was a really weak schedule at home, and just like it's been a while since they've had some really good home games, and this year was kind of no different until now. And that's the thing is, but at least they've had some really good road games this year. But this is a chance for Notre Dame to say, hey, we're good now, right? We had some slip ups, but we're good now. Will they do it? I don't know, Ryan. Our Irish Breakdown staff is split on that, so. Let's dive into the prediction and we've talked about the magnitude. We've talked about that all week. Now let's dive into predictions. And I'm going to start by giving the predictions of the rest of our staff. And then I'll give Ryan an opportunity to first share his prediction on the game. And we'll how he thinks it's going to play out, and we'll have some fun with it. So first of all, updated standings. Ryan, you are tied for second in the standings this weekend. And looking at the games, there's going to be some opportunities. The picks, there's going to be some opportunities for you to perhaps climb up the rankings a little bit this week. So obviously the Notre Dame game is going to be one because you are tied with Vince for second place. And Vince picked Clemson to win 28-24. Sean Stiers also picked Clemson to win 24-17. Andrew McDonough picked Notre Dame to win, or Clemson to win 20-13. Sean Davis picked Notre Dame to win 27-20. So now it's time for you and I to share our picks, Ryan. So I will let you begin. Explain kind of what your score is and how you got there, how you see this game playing out, what gives you the confidence you have, and what your prediction will be.
For the most part, Brian, I feel like the staff was pretty even, although there were different predictions to which side will win on what the score is going to kind of be, and I feel like for me, I predicted Notre Dame 23-20 because I think that Notre Dame has everything that you look for and Clemson also to make this a little bit of a dogfight. They have both teams are teams that want to run the football, obviously at a high volume, and they want to do it well. Everything else kind of works off of the run game offensively for each team. Both teams boast good defenses. We talked about Clemson with the front seven that they have. We talked about what Notre Dame's done pretty consistently throughout the season now. This has a chance, I think, and struggling quarterback play for both teams. Like, I feel like these teams are a little bit of mirror images of one another in a lot of ways. So I think that this game is one that could be a little bit of a dogfight. And I think that for me, what gives me confidence in where Notre Dame is trending is I felt like early in the year, there was a little bit of an identity crisis with this Notre Dame team. I do feel like over the last couple games, you're starting to really see what Notre Dame wants to be as a football team, both offensively and defensively. Are there things that need to improve? Of course there is. Is there some things that still need to get figured out from an identity perspective? Yes. But I do think that there's a clearer picture of what this team does want to be. I feel like they've kind of answered the question of is this team going to tap out or is this team going to kind of pack it in? I don't think they have, obviously, based upon what we saw last weekend. So I think Notre Dame wins in a dogfight. 23-20, really highly contested game. But I think that Notre Dame has been in some games that are, closer than people anticipated. They've had to win some ugly ones. They've also won a couple very convincingly. So I think when you look at this team, I think the mental toughness is really going to shine through. So give me Notre Dame 23-20 in a squeaker over Clemson in a little bit of an ugly battle in South Bend this weekend.
Ryan, I've been kind of back and forth on how I was going to predict this game all week in regard to the score. But here's one thing I have not really been doubted this week, and that is that Notre Dame is going to win. And there's no justification for that. Like, there's no based on how they've played, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's why I'm confident the Notre Dame is going to win. It's more of just a gut, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. I mean, I could sit here and I could explain this matchup and that matchup and this statistic and that statistic and, home versus road, all these kind of things. And the reality is we don't know what Notre Dame is going to do. This is such a hard team to predict because there have been such a dramatic difference in performances this season. Notre Dame against North Carolina, then Syracuse and Ohio State looks like a completely different team than Notre Dame against Marshall and Cal and those type of teams. So, that's kind of the thing that makes it really, difficult to do is to say, I don't know what they're going to do. I have no clue if Drew Pine is going to play better. I have no clue if the defense is going to shut Clemson down. I have no clue how they're going to do it. So I'm just going to go off of my gut. And my gut is I just feel like this team is going to come out ready to play. I don't think the issues we've seen at Notre Dame this year, Ryan, are home versus away. I don't. We're going to find out if I'm right about that. I think the issues have been a team that has lacked some maturity and lacked some focus this year. Isn't able to get itself ready to play relative to the competition that they're going to face. I think, and it just so happened that all the teams they've played away from home have been pretty good teams, or at least perceived to be by the players, because it ultimately doesn't matter how good that team actually is. Like somebody, I think I said this earlier in the week, somebody's trying to tell me, well, BYU, that doesn't make sense because BYU hasn't won a game since. I said, that's irrelevant. It's about this team's thoughts, this team's thought process, this team's perception. BYU going into that game was the number 16 team in the country. Was BYU favored that game? I can't remember if BYU was favored in that game or not.
I believe they were. I believe they were.
So, you look at it that way, Ryan, and you say, the perception was that this was a really good football team. And then you throw in the Las Vegas aspect of it, and you throw in, different things like that. This was perceived to be a big game for Notre Dame. North Carolina at the time, and some response was, well, Notre Dame was actually 3.5-point favorite go at the day of the game or the day before the game. So if you look at the matchup against North Carolina, North Carolina hasn't beaten anybody. Well, okay, that may be true, but they were an undefeated team scoring over 50 points a game. The perception was this is going to be a really tough game. And then, of course, last week against Syracuse, you may not think Syracuse, not you, Ryan, just generally speaking, a person may think Syracuse isn't that good, but the reality is Syracuse was 6-1, number 16 in the country. They were creeping up on the top 10 until they lost to Clemson in a dogfight in a game. Those Notre Dame players popped in the film and watched them outplay Clemson for almost 3 quarters, right? Got a 21-10 lead on Clemson. So the perception was we got to bring our A game. I think that's been more of their issue this year. And I think this is a game they're going to be up. They're going to be up for it. I don't think Drew Pine is as bad as he looked the last 3 weeks. The question is can he shake out of that funk and play more like I think he's capable of, or is this just he just can't get out of his own way? It's just too in his head. I don't know the answer to that. I'm gonna bet on Drew Pine this week, though. That's really what it comes down to. I think Drew's gonna be ready to play, and honestly, I think Tommy Rees is hearing the noise. I think he's hearing the criticism that we lobby, that other people lobby, that fans lobby. I know he's hearing it, and I feel like he, say what you want about Tommy Rees, he's a pretty competitive dude. And I think he's going to look at this as an opportunity to go out and kind of shut people up. And I hope he does. I mean, because that's going to be good for Notre Dame. So I think they can physically go toe-to-toe with Clemson. I think they can match Clemson in the trenches. I think they can match Clemson athlete for athlete. I wholeheartedly believe that. The question is, can they match Clemson's focus, and can they match Clemson's execution? That's the question. And I believe that they will. And that's why I predict Notre Dame to win 27-20. Now, I could see a scenario where Notre Dame wins by more by pouring it on late if they get up and Clemson has to try to go outside of their comfort zone to try to do things to get a score, and then Notre Dame pounces and puts it away. I think Notre Dame will be the better team tomorrow. Now, again, there's no statistical analysis that supports that. There's no film analysis that supports that. That's my gut. I'm just being honest where I came to that, right? I look at these two teams, Ryan, and as I break down film, and I'm curious if you've had this thought too, Ryan. When I break down film, like even last week against Syracuse, like there's times like, man, they're gonna destroy Syracuse. And then there's other times I'm like, I don't know about that. That concerns me a little bit, and I felt that way that week. Clearly felt that way against Ohio State. I was like, I think they can beat them, man, but this is going to be hard. That's going to be tough. This is going to be tough. North Carolina, I really felt like they're going to beat North Carolina, but there was times where I was like, boy, this is going to be a tough matchup, and so sometimes I'll be a little, man, boy, I don't know, man. This is going to be this week. From the moment I started, I've watched Clemson on TV this year. But from the moment I popped in Clemson's film all week, I just kept saying, this is a good matchup for Notre Dame. They don't do a ton of the things that give Notre Dame problems. Quarterback runs is about the only thing. Like, they're not real dynamic like they used to be. They're not just the elite. Man, this defense, boy, you just can't handle the speed of this defense. They just blitz at you they're just not who they've been. They're still a very good football team, but for whatever reason, Ryan, I don't know why. As I break down the film, I just don't get that. Oh man, my only concern this week is, will Notre Dame show up and play its game? That's the only question I have. Where other times I'm like, even if Notre Dame plays okay, North Carolina can hurt you. Ohio State can hurt you. Syracuse can hurt you. This is one of those games where it's like, if Notre Dame plays their game, it's the individual matchup against Clemson. I just feel like Notre Dame matches up really well against them. And that's where a lot of my confidence comes from.
And I agree with you in that take because, again, I think that there's mirror images to this team, to Clemson, in the sense that I think that Notre Dame can match the physicality and the talent level up front. I do, right? Like, I think that when you look at a matchup of Joe Alt versus Miles Murphy, for instance, or one of the other former 5-star defensive ends and Blake Fisher, or Jared Patterson versus Brian Bresee or Tyler Davis. I feel like Notre Dame can win enough of those matchups to come out victorious. I think the difference between this Clemson team in years past is when Clemson was at its top, Brian, like, yeah, they were still really good in the trenches, obviously, defensively especially, right? Like, they always had guys on the defensive line. But when they were at their peak, they also had guys like Mike Williams, like Justin Ross, like T. Higgins at wide receiver. Cornerback, they've had guys like A.J. Terrell and Trayvon Mullen. Taiwan's his little brother that plays at Indiana. But they've always had these corners. They've had these wide receivers that are just NFL level dudes, right? Like they've had those guys. This team doesn't really have that, right? Like they still have some nice wide receivers. Like Joseph Ngata is a good football player. He is. Bo Collins is a pretty good football player, but they're not the difference maker, dynamic players they've had at the position. Cornerback wise, they have some talent there, but there's no Andrew Booth out there, right? There's no AJ Terrell out there. Like they just don't have that guy right now on the roster. So I think the spots that had generally made you worry about this situation, and they obviously don't have a Trevor Lawrence at quarterback either, but the difference maker at those positions, the very important positions in the past for Clemson, just aren't what they have been. So your thought process, and this is why I think it's going to be a kind of a tight and a little bit of a dogfight, is that I think Notre Dame is good in a lot of the same places that Clemson is also good. So again, this is a movable object versus a full forced sledgehammer coming at it, right? Like what's going to break? There's going to be a breaking point in this game. There's going to be a breaking point because I think that this game, some people I've seen on Twitter and such and have said, Clemson's going to run away with this. And I just don't see that, man. I really don't.
Could it happen? Sure.
It could, but I think much more likely. Yeah. This is a highly contested game, which tells me if this is a highly contested game where teams are matching blow for blow, there's going to be a breaking point. And in those high pressure situations, which team is going to make a play? Going to make a series of plays. Which team is going to rise to the occasion? I am interested to see if Notre Dame gets Clemson's back to the wall early in this game, how they respond to it. Because I think that Notre Dame has shown me over the last couple weeks, particularly last week, that there might be some mental toughness to this team. Again, it could have been easy for them to fold. So I'm interested in two physical teams that make their living off of being dominant in the trenches, running the football, stopping the run. Which team breaks when that breaking point happens? That's what I'm looking for this weekend.
Yeah. Ryan, I think you hit the nail on the head. Look, could Clemson blow this game out? Sure. I mean, Notre Dame could go again. If Notre Dame plays like they did against Stanford and Marshall and Cal, Clemson's going to win convincingly. If Notre Dame plays like they did, we've done this, right? We've done this all week. And that's the thing is, like, am I going to tell someone, you're nuts if you think Clemson's going to blow Notre Dame out? No, I'm not going to tell you you're nuts because I don't know what freaking version of Notre Dame is going to show up this weekend. But, Ryan, the other part of this, too, is what needs to be acknowledged is Notre Dame has a chance to win this game convincingly if Clemson's doesn't bring their A game, right? I mean, that's the other thing, too, is I'm anticipating both teams bringing it this weekend. That's where I'm coming from. There's always the things where, like for example, you look at certain games and you say, Georgia plays Alabama in the SEC title game and Alabama smacks them. Okay, well, they wouldn't play it in the championship game. Did the same thing happen again? No, the reverse happened. I mean, Georgia won the game. Why? Because you're not the same team every single Saturday, even if you're playing the same team. You look at Georgia 2017 when Georgia goes and plays Auburn on the road in the regular season, was it like 40-17 they lost? And then they go play again in a rematch in the SEC title game and Georgia smacks them. So it just, what version of you is going to show up today? I think both of these teams are going to at least bring their B-plus games. I do. If one of them does it, then it'll be a convincing win for the other team. I believe so. But, I have confidence in this Notre Dame team, and it's not confidence they've necessarily earned, Ryan. It's not. It's just the feeling I've had all week. And, I could be wrong. So the reason I'm clear on this is because I want people to understand why I'm picking it this way. It's not like, you break it down. And, I mean, if you break it down, like you said, right, these are two pretty evenly matched teams.
They are.
And very similar. We talked about that all week. Very similar in a lot of different ways. So that's kind of that's where I'm at with this game, right? And that's why I predicted the way that I predicted. I could see Notre Dame winning this game convincingly if Clemson has an off day. Now, sometimes an off day can be because of the other team, right? I mean, Ryan, you played football, right? I mean, sometimes it's like, yeah, we had an off day. Why? Because that other team smacked us in the mouth and they schemed us well, and you know what I mean? Like we had an off, like we had a coach against Mount Union in the playoff. We had an off day that day. Why? Because Mount Union made us have an off day. You know what I mean? Right. Like we won 41-0 the previous round of the playoff, right? It's just we had an off day because of them. You know,
it's not exactly. It's not always self-inflicted when you have a bad day. Like I feel like we don't always give enough credit to like, hey, there's some good players on the other side of the field usually, right? Like those guys could just have had a good day, which caused us to have a bad day. Like there's no shame in that. It just is what it is. Right. I mean, because Brian, could there be a reality where Brian Bresee has the career game, has the best game of his life, and Jared Patterson still plays a pretty good game, but Brian Bresee's just a dude, right? Like, could that happen? It's possible. Yeah, sure. It's possible. Yeah. Very possible.
Yeah. You know, and the same thing is true where Brian Bresee is off and Rook is a little bit off, and Jarrett Patterson and Josh Lugg play the game of their lives, and Notre Dame runs for 200-plus yards. I mean, there's all types of different scenarios. It just depends on who brings it, you know, who brings it, who executes the best, you know, which struggling quarterback has the best day, you know, who is better prepared to handle the elements. It looks like the rain is going to be, based on the latest weather reports. Actually, I haven't checked in a few hours, and as I've told you, if you know anything about northern Indiana, it's not as bad as when I lived in Colorado, Ryan. The mantra in Colorado, you've heard it. It's other places like this, but if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes. You know, we'd sit there, it would like snow. We'd get like a foot of snow on a Monday, and by Wednesday, you didn't know it snowed, and it was 70. I mean, it was wild. But, you know, as of tomorrow, looking by game time, by kickoff time, the chance of rain is down to 5%. It's as high as 58 at 9 a.m., as high as 50 in the afternoon at 1 p.m., 53. Then it goes down to 47, 38, 19, 15, 15, 5 at 7, 2 by 8, 2 by 9, 3 by 10, 3 by 11. So it doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of that, but the wind is 13 to 21 miles an hour around that time. So, you know, who handles the elements? I hope that the elements aren't a factor. I want it to be a game where whoever wins, there's no, oh, gee, well, we might have done this, we might have done that if it wasn't for this or wasn't for that. You know, we've talked about that in the 2015 game, right? Well, I've had people say, well, if it's dry that day, Notre Dame wins. I'm like, yeah, if it's dry that day, Deshaun Watson throws for more than 90 yards and he shreds Brian Van Gorder's defense. Like, that's what happens if it's dry that day, right? Like Notre Dame was able to handle that element better than Clemson did. And so I've laughed when people said, now what I have said is if Malik Zaire plays, I think Notre Dame wins that game. That's what I have said. But I think the weather that day helped Notre Dame more than it helped Clemson, because you could say, well, Notre Dame had fumbles because of the weather. And I'd say, yeah, let me remind you, Deshaun Watson passed for 90 yards in that game, right, against a Brian Van Gorder defense. Why? Because Clemson got a lead early and they didn't want to take a chance of you know, making a mistake. And so they just kind of ran it. And I'm actually going to pull his numbers up. I was wrong. He didn't pass for 90 yards. He passed for 84 yards. He went 10 of 21 for 84 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. So,
I think the reason for that is because Brian Van Gorder just had an excellent game plan that day.
See, now you're just trolling. Now you're just trolling at this point in time. But in all seriousness, like, I don't want that to be the case. I don't want there to be any excuses. You nailed it. There's no injuries that can factor into it, all those type of things. Yep. So I'm very, very happy to I'm looking forward to this one. I'm really looking forward to this one. So, and enough with the Jaden Greathouse decommitment stuff. People, stop. Just stop.
Did someone say that?
Okay?
Did someone say
that? There's somebody. Yeah, just chill out. Okay. He's visiting Texas with friends who are also looking at Texas. Yes. Trust me, Jaden Greathouse is very solid to Notre Dame.
Go read my visit preview of him yesterday if you want to hear what he's talking about.
Chill out a little bit, everybody. All right. Yeah. So anyway, Ryan, I picked Notre Dame. You picked Notre Dame. Sean Davis also picked Notre Dame. Sean and I had the same score. I was joking with him about that last night. So I always make my pick before I see everybody else's, and so then I see, Sean picked my score as well. So I had to bust his chops a little bit about that one as well. So that's it for the Notre Dame prediction, Ryan. Again, big opportunity for Notre Dame. Really big opportunity for Notre Dame. Let's move on after this to some predictions of other scores. But first, we're going to obviously, before we go to the other predictions, obviously hit that like button, everybody, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and share this podcast. So, Ryan, obviously the game that matters most is Notre Dame and Clemson, right? That's the game that matters most to us for what we do.
Yes.
But as people who love college football, there are some great games on this weekend. The only thing that ticks me off is that so many of those games are like around the same time the Notre Dame game is, which really ticks me off. I'm not happy about that at all. Some really big time games this week, and we're going to break those down now and preview those games now. So let's begin, Mr. Roberts, with a look at the most marquee matchup of the weekend, and that is the number one, I can't believe I'm saying this, the number one Tennessee Volunteers at the number 3 defending champ Georgia Bulldogs. This game is going to be at 3:30 p.m., so this is one we'll get to watch. It's going to be on ABC, and Georgia is a 7.5-point favorite. Now, Ryan, listen, you and I talked before the season. We previewed the year, and Tennessee was a team that we both felt was a sleeper team. When I thought sleeper team, I thought 10-2. You know, if they can keep building, they have a shot. They have jumped faster than I thought they were going to jump. And they have been an outstanding football team, and they've done so without their best receiver. Cedric Tillman is back now. He was back last week on a bit of a pitch count, and he had like 4 catches for 22 yards on a bit of a pitch count in a game that they just wiped Kentucky off the map. Hendon barely played in the second half. I mean, they played Georgia, who went through a stretch, Ryan, in sort of middle of the season where you're like, Georgia doesn't look too good right now, you know? And that was against they had an ugly win over Kent State. And then a week later, they honestly, for all intents and purposes, got outplayed for 60 minutes, really, or 58 minutes by Missouri, who's not very good. So that was a very intriguing game. And now you say, okay, well, hey, look, Georgia's vulnerable. Well, since then, Georgia has commenced on beating Auburn 42-10. They beat Vanderbilt 55-0, and they beat Florida last week 42-20. That was a very strange game. Florida obviously jumped out to, Georgia jumped out to a big lead. I think it was like 28-3 at one point in time, 21-3. Florida battled back to make it 28-20, and then I think it was 28-20 late in the third quarter. They went up 28-20 late in the third quarter, and then Georgia put it away in the fourth quarter. Georgia's done that a lot this year, Ryan. They've had several games this year that if you look at the final score, you're like, man, they really blew that team out. But you're like, yeah, but if you watch the game, it was a lot more competitive than that for a while. Of course, the exception being the Oregon game at the beginning of the year where they just dominated Georgia from beginning to end. Tennessee got here, Ryan, a different path. Obviously, they had some sloppy wins early. I was not overly impressed with them against Pittsburgh. They outplayed Florida, but let Florida kind of rally back late. Since then, however, they've been hot. They destroyed LSU on the road. Had a great game against Alabama. They got up big on Alabama. I mean, I thought they were going to blow Alabama out, but you don't discount Bryce Young. Bryce Young brings them back, makes it a close game, 49-49. Bama has a chance to win it, can't win it. Tennessee has a chance to win it. They get it done. And then, of course, last week
with the ugliest field goal of all time, by the way, that Tennessee kicked, last one.
the ugliest made field goal of all time.
Yes.
And then, of course, in the sandwich in between there was an FCS opponent that doesn't really matter. So they're red hot. Georgia's hot. So both of these teams, I feel like, Ryan, are coming into this matchup kind of playing their best football, which makes it an even better game. So let's kind of talk about kind of your prediction, how you see this game playing out, because you and I don't see eye to eye on this game. So let me hear your prediction and how you got to it.
This is a really interesting game, Brian, because I will be very honest about it. I wrestled with this one back and forth. I really did. Like I think there's a reality where Tennessee wins this football game. I think there's a reality where Georgia wins this football game. I started thinking about where are these teams, what is the biggest strengths on each one of these teams, and which one of those strengths do I think can shine through the most? That's kind of where my mind went. I think for Tennessee, you have to go with that high-octane offense, right? You go with Hendon Hooker, who has to be the Heisman frontrunner at this point. You talk about Jalen Hyatt, who's just been on an absolute tear at wide receiver over the last few games. You now have Cedric Tillman back from injury. You also have Brew McCoy, who's had some spurts of good football at wide receiver for Tennessee. So for me, the best part of Tennessee right now is that high-octane offense and that passing attack especially, right? Like they have some dudes at wide receiver that are playing tremendous football, and they have a signal caller that is playing about as high level as any quarterback in college football. When I look how that matches up against Georgia, though, I look at Georgia and say, well, Georgia has a pretty darn good secondary, man. They do. You look at Kaylee Ringo. You look at Malachi Starks, who's only a true freshman, but is playing fantastic football. Talk about Chris Smith at safety, who's been playing very high level so far this year. They have a secondary where I think you're not going to shut down Tennessee, but can you limit them enough is where my mind goes, right? And I think that they can have a good battle with those Tennessee wide receivers. And then when you ask me, what is Georgia's best area of their football? And I go, in the trenches is where they win their football games, right? Like you talk about the offensive line with Jones at left tackle has been a really good football player for them. Xavier Truss at guard has been a pretty good player this year. Defensive line wise, you have guys like Jalen Carter. Even though Nolan Smith is out now, they still have some depth up front, obviously. And then I start comparing that to what Tennessee has offensive and defensive line wise. And I think that that's where the biggest impact or biggest difference in this football game can be, because Tennessee's been pretty good offensive line wise. They've been pretty good, but I still think Georgia has the guys, obviously, that are going to be able to take advantage of them at points in this football game. And Tennessee's defensive line, they have Byron Young at defensive end, who's a pretty good player. I like Tyler Barron, the other defensive end. But I think that that's the biggest difference. Is I think Georgia
Tennessee's not winning this game with defense.
Exactly.
They're not winning this game with defense.
Exactly.
That's for certain.
So when I look at these two teams, I say I think that Georgia has some guys that can not stifle, but can limit some of the big impact of what Tennessee does really well. But I think Georgia has an advantage where they win their game. So I think that they have the ability to potentially wear them down. I still can't count out the fact that, hey, Hendon Hooker's going to make some plays. Jalen Hyatt's going to make some plays. Cedric Tillman's going to make some plays, which is why I think they're still going to keep it a close game. But I took Georgia 31-28 just because I think that the strength of Georgia has a little bit more of a difference versus Tennessee than what Tennessee's strength is against Georgia. So give me Georgia in this football game.
Some of the other staff picks, Vince picked Tennessee to win 38-35. Ryan, you said Georgia 31-28 was your score. Sean Davis also picked Georgia, a very similar score, 34-27. Sean Stiers picked Tennessee 31-27, and Andrew McDonough picked Georgia to win 34-27. So just so people understand, we all do these independently. Like everybody makes their own picks and then sends them into me. I collect them and put them into an article. So I think everybody sees this game being somewhat similar except for me. And I'm actually going with Tennessee to win this football game. And I'm not only going with Tennessee to win this football game, I'm going with Tennessee to win this football game somewhat convincingly. I'm going 37-28. And here's what I'm going to say. I don't agree that Georgia has a great secondary. I think they have a very talented secondary, athletic secondary. If I'm looking at it from an NFL draft standpoint, I see the things that you see, but they don't play anybody that's any good throwing the football. And it's the same exact thing I said last year. I said, if Georgia plays a team that can throw, they're going to be in trouble. And Tennessee actually threw the ball pretty well on them early last year until their receivers got knocked out. They ended up throwing for 344 yards. They had some padded fourth quarter stats in that game. I think Joe Milton came off the bench late when the game was it was out of control, and threw for like 100 yards or something like that. So it wasn't like a 344 like you would normally get. But I thought early on, Hendon Hooker was having success. He was beating Georgia. They were in the game. And then they had already had some receiver injuries coming into the game, and then one of their receivers got knocked out of that game. I'm not in love with Georgia's defense this year. I'm not. They're very talented, but they're winning on talent. They've let teams hang around. They've let teams move the ball on them in ways that you don't expect them to move a ball. They haven't played anybody that's any good on offense yet, Ryan. That's the thing for me. And here's the other problem. Last year, Georgia had a pretty decent pass rush. They had 49 sacks in 15 games. It was pretty good, right? And yeah. I'm looking at their sacks per game last year. Georgia was, and again, they're not a heavy pressure team, but last year, Georgia ranked 6th in the nation in sacks per game. This year, however, Georgia ranks 120th. They only have 10 sacks this year, and they just lost their best pure edge rusher in Nolan Smith.
Mhm.
So that's the big thing for me is I have to kind of assume that Georgia's just going to magically discover a pass rush that they haven't had all year. You know, they only have 10 on the year, and the guy that has 3 of those 10 is now out. And so that to me is where I think they're going to have trouble putting pressure on Hendon Hooker in their base defense. Georgia is a base defense team. Would you agree with that? Like they're going to line up and just play their game. They can be vulnerable when they have to heat you up. And I think they're going to have to heat Hendon Hooker up. Now, the question is how good is Cedric Tillman going to be in this game? That was my one hesitation because I don't think Jalen Hyatt's good enough by himself to beat Georgia. Because as you said, you could just put Keely Ringo on him and he'll still get some yards, but it's going to be like, he gets 6 catches for 90 yards, but it's on 14 targets instead of 8, like he's been in a lot of other games, right? And so you make him work for it. And Tennessee has some nice complementary weapons. That's something else I like. Everybody talks about Jalen Hyatt for good reason. Brew McCoy's had a really steady year. Ramel Keaton's had a nice steady year. They have a kid named Squirrel White who it's like, what? Okay, whatever.
Is he a slot receiver? He's got to be a slot receiver.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he's a little 5'10", skinny freshman kid. Number 10. He's number 10. And then, of course, you get Cedric Tillman back, who, even though he's only played 4 games, has 21 catches on the season, and he was expected to be their best player. So it's the volume of weapons they have. I think that Tennessee is going to be able to kind of, I've said this, like work outside in, where they're going to have some success throwing the RPOs, getting the ball outside, going tempo against a Georgia team that at times can be vulnerable to tempo if you have good perimeter skill. And then that's going to open up some opportunities to, gash a little bit up the middle. That's kind of how I see it playing out. I see it 37-28. I could see it being a Georgia win. I'm not going to sit there and say Georgia can't win. I just think this is not a great matchup for Georgia, for me, of this version of Georgia, because I don't think they can rush the quarterback. And I don't think you can beat them if you can't pressure Hendon Hooker. Like, that's the one thing LSU was able to do a little bit in that game is you kind of got him off, he wasn't as sharp in that game. They had some early pressures. He got that shot in the ribs. You remember that in the first half, and he just wasn't quite the same. Yeah. Georgia just hasn't shown me that this year. Could it step up? And because here's the counter argument to that, Ryan. Well, Georgia's a team that knows they're better than everybody they've played so far. And so, they don't have that. They haven't had that locked in, we're ready to rock and roll thing, right? They haven't had that. And they're going to do that now because they're excited and they're and then they got a little bit more pressure on Florida last week than they really have in a lot of other games, but Florida's, pass blocking isn't very good. So, and then I think, look, if you watch that Florida game, there was about 3 big plays that Stetson Bennett hit that probably should have been turnovers against a competent team. I mean, like that long touchdown pass to Brock Bowers, that's not happening again this week in that way. That ball's getting picked. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like it should have been picked. And Georgia had some of that stuff last week. And they're a really inconsistent team, which isn't overly surprising when you consider how much they lost from last year. And they're still very good. But I really like Tennessee. I thought if Tennessee was going to fade, it had happened already. That's my thing, is because they had 3 out of 4 weeks where they had LSU, Bama, and Kentucky, and they haven't taken a step back yet. So I like what this team is doing. I'm going with Tennessee to win this football game.
I have 2 notes. One, my nickname in high school was actually Squirrel Roberts as well, so I appreciate it. Very, very quick. Very. Second, greatest stat I've ever seen, Brian. I saw a stat yesterday. Stetson Bennett only has 2 completions over 40 yards this year. Joe Milton has 3.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that a great stat? It's a great stat, man. It's a great stat.
Now, two completions that traveled over 40 yards?
No, I think that were plus 40. Just, catch and runs. Yeah.
Wow. Did they both happen last week against Florida? So I know one of them did.
Maybe it was in the air. Either way, I know that Joe Milton had more than Stetson Bennett, which was pretty wild. It was pretty wild.
Whew. Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. I don't know.
You can probably call Stetson Bennett Squirrel Bennett as well. He kind of gives me the vibes. Yeah.
Well, hold on a second now. I was reading on Twitter, from draft Twitter early in the year that Stetson Bennett was climbing up draft boards with how well he was shredding teams that stink.
Oh, are you Are you a part of draft Twitter?
I just like when you get into it with draft Twitter. That's my experience with draft Twitter, is watching Ryan get into it draft Twitter. Because people look at the numbers and like, oh man, he's got good numbers. He's averaging, what's he averaging this year, Ryan? I was looking at his numbers. I mean, he's averaging 293 yards passing per game. He's had, 4 games of over 300 yards, and it's just like, yeah, against who? That's kind of my thing. Is like, it's
he's got
not,
that. Yeah. He's got that dog. He's got that dog in him, man. Coach's son. First man in, last man out. Yeah. All that good stuff.
I guess. No, I like Stetson Bennett. He's a nice college quarterback.
Very good college quarterback.
I just don't see it as a game that I just don't think this is a good matchup. And again, when I look at this, Ryan, that's what football is, man. It's matchups. It's a game of matchups, and I just like this matchup for Tennessee. Next game, Ryan, there's another huge matchup in the SEC this weekend, and that is the matchup between number 6 Alabama, the 7-1 Crimson Tide, against the number 10 – sorry, I didn't mean to laugh when I said that – the number 10 LSU Tigers, who are having a nice year so far. They are. I mean, they are. Yep. They are 6-2 right now. The game is at 7:00 on Saturday evening on ESPN. Alabama is a 13.5-point favorite, which I'll be honest, surprised me a little bit. Alabama, as we talked about, is 7-1. This is an Alabama team that has not looked as good as it has in the past, yet still is a missed field goal away from being 8-0 with a win at Tennessee. So not as good as they've been, is still really good. And LSU kind of looked a little rough early in the season. Did not look like a great team. Obviously lost their opener against Florida State in the game. They thoroughly got outplayed. Had a nice win over Mississippi State. Then just New Mexico is not very good. Ugly win over Auburn. Got blown out by Tennessee. And then 2 convincing wins over, the Florida game was more convincing to me, even though it was a 10-point game. I thought LSU outplayed them more. The Ole Miss game ended up being a blowout late. They outscored Ole Miss 21-0 in the fourth quarter. It was 24-20 going into the fourth quarter, and Ole Miss obviously had it was a much more competitive game. But they handled their business and got the win, and they're playing better football. This matchup obviously is a huge chance for Brian Kelly to have that statement win going into his first season, right? A lot of LSU people said this is going to be a rebuild year. When they lost to Florida State, what did everybody say? Rebuild year, rebuild year, rebuild year. Well, this is a chance to squash that. You beat Alabama. It's not a rebuild year, right? And I think it'll really do a lot of good things for Brian Kelly's staff's recruiting if you can beat Bama, be 7-2. You look at the rest of their schedule, Ryan. There's some potential toe stubbing moments at Arkansas, at A&M, sandwiched between a home game against UAB. But if you're good enough to beat Bama, you're good enough to beat Texas A&M and Arkansas. So it's a huge opportunity for Brian Kelly and LSU. And obviously Alabama is still jockeying to get back into playoff contention. I think that's why LSU was 10th, to be honest with you, is because they're setting Alabama up for a chance to get a big top 10 win. So, Ryan, how do you see this game playing out? Actually, let me just do this real quick, Ryan. So before you and I go, let's just quickly give everybody else's picks, and then you and I can give our picks as well. I think that might make it a little bit cleaner. So we have Vince D'Addario picked Alabama to win 41-21. Sean Davis picked Alabama to win 30-21. Sean Stiers picked Alabama to win 37-20, and Andrew McDonough picked Alabama to win 44-28. So, Squirrel Roberts, how do you see this game playing out? Who do you have winning, and why?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Your name wasn't serious. Your nickname wasn't seriously Squirrel, was it? Please tell me you're joking.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
Okay.
I actually did have.
It is now.
I actually did have a football nickname, but it was Sass. People could just call me like Sasquatch, like you're big and Anyway, that's conversation for another time.
It's Squirrel now, but yes, I was curious.
It's Squirrel now. Yeah. That was 14 years ago, Ryan Roberts. Anyway, so it doesn't matter anymore. So, what I feel about this game, Brian. And I'm going to start with the positives for LSU because I will give them credit in the sense that after seeing the first couple games, particularly that Florida State game, I thought they were in a little bit of trouble. I did. Like offensive line wise, looked awful in that football game. I mean, we talk about what Jared Verse did against that team it was a man amongst boys in that football game. Defensive line, I feel like they didn't really do much in that game as well. It was a little bit of a sparse performance. Then you see Jaden Daniels just looked out of sync early on, especially, the first few games. Keyshawn Boutte wasn't really doing much. And I give LSU credit. They have definitely played at a more confident level over the last few games, and they do seem to be playing with a better drive and a better determination, and they do seem to have a little bit more of a physical style that they've kind of, I think, have found a little bit of their identity. So I will give Brian Kelly and his staff all the credit for that one, because I think that it started out very rough, and he has recovered for what it was early on for LSU. Now, in this football game, Alabama, I believe at this point, is just a higher caliber of talents comparative to an LSU, right? Like, they've gotten a lot out of guys like Jaden Daniels, Mekhi Gardner, who's their corner that's playing at a pretty good level. That was a transfer from Louisiana Lafayette. Like, they've gotten some good performances out of, relatively talented players. But when you compare them to a Bryce Young, to a Kool-Aid McKinstry, to a Jordan Battle, to a Ryan Branch, those types of players, I just think Alabama's in a different league from a talent level perspective. So I do think LSU will score a little bit, because one thing that Alabama has struggled with historically over the last few years is athletic quarterbacks that can extend plays. And that is what Jaden Daniels is, right? Like, he can do that type of stuff off script as an extender in the running game. So I think LSU is going to score a little bit. So I ended up giving them 28 points, but the difference is that I just think that Alabama's higher caliber of athletes are just going to be the difference in this football game. So give me Alabama 45-28. Again, it's not anything against LSU, because they have come a long way. I just think in this football game, Alabama just has a different level of talent comparative to LSU. It's not a great matchup to them.
Pettiness, hate. It's a bad matchup. It's a bad matchup for them. And I think the part you nailed, Ryan, is the pass rush. Like, they made Tennessee's defensive line look like they were dudes in that game. I mean, they just harassed Jaden Daniels all game long. This is a team in LSU that struggles to protect the quarterback. I mean, and they really have most of the season, which is why they've been kind of a team that's been forced to be a bit of a short throw kind of team. They rank 118th in the country, Ryan, in sacks allowed. That's not good, right? Especially when you look at the schedule that they've played. And then you look at this Alabama defense, which ranks 21st in the nation in sacks per game and has two guys on the edge in Dallas Turner and Will Anderson, who are just
dudes.
Talented dudes. Now, neither of their production has been elite. I mean, it's been spread out, but I mean, it's a bad matchup for the LSU offensive tackles, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, Brian, it's funny because we talked about this in the preseason, right? Will Anderson wasn't going to have the same production he had last year, right? Because the target's on his back.
Sure.
Like, he's not going to have another 30-plus tackles for loss and 17 and a half sacks again. Like, it's unrealistic. So his sack number is a little down, but then I just saw a graphic this morning that was like, I think he had like 40 pressures so far this year on top of like the 7 sacks or whatever he has right now. I mean, to your point, Darnell Wright's a pretty decent player at right tackle for Tennessee. Their left tackle was okay, but when you're talking about the matchup with them against Will Anderson and Dallas Turner and those boys up front, it's just not a great matchup for LSU. It's just not. It's I think it's going to be a little bit of a tough game, because I think anytime you've seen LSU this year play against a potent pass rusher, again, I talked about Jared Verse from Florida State. You mentioned Tennessee with Byron Young and Tyler Barron. It's been a lopsided affair in those battles. So I just don't think that LSU quite has the guys to counteract the Will Andersons of the world. I think that's where things get a little tough for them.
Yeah, I mean, and it's Will Anderson, but it's also the fact it's Will Anderson and Dallas Turner. And I think that's a kid who I think is going to have a bit of a breakout. He has not been as good as I thought he would be this year, but he's still been solid. To your just real quick, Ryan, Pro Football Focus has Will Anderson as having 37 pressures this year in 8 games. That's off of 247 total pass rushes, which is like less than 1 every 8, which is pretty good. Pretty good. And he has 17 hits and or sacks on the quarterback. He also has 20 run stops on the season, which is pretty good. So I think it's a bad matchup. Alabama is not a team that you want to be a dink and dunk offense against. You have to be able to take some shots, and that's just not something LSU has been able to do. Not because Jalen Daniels is incapable of it. It's just that he doesn't get the time to throw the ball down the field, and I think that's the concerning part about the matchup. I mean, look, just give you some context. Again, what do you say about Pro Football Focus? Right, they're not a team. The grades stink, but their data collection is pretty good. In 8 games, so it'd be 237 passing attempts. Jaden Daniels has only completed 10 balls beyond 20 yards past the line of scrimmage. He's 10 of 23 on deep balls, right? Which is not great. It's actually a decent completion percentage. It's not a lot, right? You look at Bryce Young, who missed 2 games basically. Bryce Young, in 221 attempts this year, has thrown 32 deep balls in obviously fewer games. Completion percentage is similar. He's thrown a total of 90 passes beyond 10 yards, where Jaden Daniels has only thrown 68 passes beyond 10 yards past the line of scrimmage, compared to 90 for Bryce Young. So again, it's one of those things where they're just not attacking down the field. I don't think you can do that against this Alabama team. Alabama's vulnerable in the pass game, Ryan. I believe they are, but they're vulnerable to a team that can attack down the field. That's my thing. I mean, you want to talk about numbers, right? Notre Dame, for all their issues this year, Notre Dame hardly throws the ball. They only have 165 pass attempts all year, compared to LSU, who has 237. Notre Dame has thrown the ball 80 fewer times, right? Not an exact, but about 80 fewer times. I didn't do the exact math. They have 68 passes on 237 attempts, LSU, beyond 10 yards. Notre Dame, on only 165 total attempts, has 53 passes beyond 10 yards, right? So I'm trying to give you context for how infrequently LSU pushes the ball down the field. I don't think you can beat Bama that way. I just don't. I don't think you can beat Bama that way. I think LSU will have some – I think the reason that my prediction, Ryan, of 37-20 is what it is because, number one, I don't think Bama has been great at just lining up and running it this year. And, their numbers are good, 211 yards a game, but their numbers are good because they've got a couple padded games against teams that aren't very good. They and they couldn't run the ball really on Tennessee. They couldn't run the ball at all last week on Mississippi State, which is strange. Didn't run great against Texas. I don't think they're not going to be like super balanced 200 and 300, I don't think, against LSU. I think they're going to be a little bit one-dimensional. And so I think that'll allow LSU to make a couple stops that they maybe otherwise wouldn't. So I think, 37 is kind of how I see Alabama. I think the fact that LSU gets to 20 has a lot to do with what you said. Jaden Daniels will make some plays with his legs in this game. He will.
100%.
And he'll hit a shot. He'll hit a shot. And I think Mike Denbrock's – I've said this before. Mike Denbrock's a really good football coach, right? And Matt House has done a really nice job of getting a defense that I thought looked bad early in the year, just did not look good. To they're playing decent football now. They are. They're not great, but they don't have the talent on defense. They actually have in my opinion, Ryan, I'm curious about this. I think their talent is better on offense than it is on defense right now. Like top all around. And so I actually like the job Matt House is doing. They're getting better and better every week, but this is a bad matchup for them. So I see it as a game that Alabama wins convincingly. I wouldn't be shocked if it's by a wider margin than we just mentioned. I wouldn't be shocked, but I do think LSU is going to come to play. The reason I think it's a 17-point game is I think the LSU kids, it's a night game. It's 7 o'clock. I think they're going to be hungry. I think they're going to battle their butts off. I just don't think they have the horses to. So this isn't like a Brian Kelly's teams don't show up for big games. I'm not even looking at that. I think they will show up to play. If they don't show up, if they have the attitude that Brian Kelly's teams have had at Notre Dame in big games and the way they did against Tennessee, it'll be worse than 40-13 because Nick Saban has no problem running the score up on teams in his conference. None. Right?
No.
So, but I just think LSU will come to play. I think these kids are going to battle for 60 minutes. I just don't think they have the horses to hang with Bama. And again, this is not a great Bama team like compared to past years, right?
Two things I'm looking forward to most this weekend, Brian. One is hopefully Notre Dame gets a big victory against Clemson. Number two is for the video to resurface of that fake conversation between Nick Saban and Brian Kelly that Joey Molinaro made or whatever. Like that's I can't wait. Can't wait.
Yeah. I like the one where he's talking to Jimbo and then Kelly. Yeah. Brian, how the hell did you get on this call? That was great.
That guy does such good work, man. It's so funny.
He really does. It's very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. So that is our prediction. The entire Irish Breakdown staff picks Alabama to go on the road and beat LSU. I ask you this, Ryan. What needs to happen for LSU to win this game? I have a couple things that need to happen. What are yours?
I mean, I think that turnovers is the biggest thing for me, right? Like if LSU kind of forces a real bad, uncharacteristic game out of Bryce Young and they turn the football over, like that's pretty much all I can think of, Brian. Like I just think that the horses are just so much different in this football game.
Yeah. I think it's about kind of like you said, they've got to pressure Bryce Young, force him into uncharacteristic mistakes. I think tipped passes, things like that. There's some things I think they can do in that regard to allow them to stay in. The problem is that LSU also isn't a great pass rushing team. They rank 63rd in the nation in sacks this year, and their overall numbers for pressures aren't nearly as dominant either. Right? I think that's an issue, but I think it's going to have to be you got to catch some breaks. And I think the other thing is LSU is going to have to try to establish the run game. Yes. I think they're going to have to try to find a way to try to get Bama to condense their box. I think their line at times blocks better for the run than they do in pass pro. So I think that's something that I want to see. They've been a very inconsistent rushing team, Ryan.
Yes.
I mean, your LSU has 55 yards against Tennessee. They go for 139 against Florida State, and then they just run the ball down Ole Miss's throat. If they can have similar success running the ball against Bama that they had against Ole Miss, and then force them a couple mistakes by the Bama offense, that's where I think they can. And honestly, this plays right into Brian Kelly's wheelhouse, Ryan. He wants to. He was always that way in big games. Let's shorten the game, and that's kind of what they need to be here. Establish the run, shorten the game, and try to create some mistakes by Alabama. That's going to be the key. I just don't, like you said, though, even if they're able to force some mistakes, I don't know if they have the horses to then capitalize on it the way that they need to, in my opinion. Yep. Ryan, next game we're going to talk about, let's go to the Big 12. It seems like for the last month and a half, every weekend, we're talking about some big, huge Big 12 game that's going to have a big impact on the conference championship. And this has been a very entertaining year in the Big 12. And one of the things I'll say is the Big 12 this year is going to be the toughest conference to win.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying like relative if you put Bama in there or Ohio State in there. I'm just saying of the teams in there because there's so much depth in the league this year. There's no great team in the Big 12. There's no Ohio State. There's no Tennessee. But it's just really good teams, and quality teams. Kansas had their run early before their quarterback Daniels got hurt. Texas Tech has had some upsets. They're starting to fade a little bit. They've just had so many tough games in a row. They kind of just, I thought, hit a wall last week against Baylor. Obviously, Oklahoma State went through a very similar thing, just like 5 just tough games in a row, and they just kind of, just wore out, I think, against Kansas State. Now, is Kansas State in that position now? And that's the game we're going to talk about now is number 24 Texas at number 13 Kansas State. It is a game that's going to kick off at 7 o'clock on Fox FS1. Texas is a 2.5-point favorite. That shocked me. I was very surprised by that. Texas, obviously 5-3, had a close game against Bama. They lost their most recent game to Oklahoma State. Also had a really sloppy win over Iowa State before that. And then, of course, blew out Oklahoma. And then prior to that, they lost to Texas Tech. But that loss to Texas Tech was without Quinn Ewers. They're a different team when they have Quinn Ewers. Kansas State has been sort of a Cinderella team this year, Ryan. Had a bad loss early in the year to Tulane. That loss doesn't look as bad now, the way that Tulane is playing. But they've battled back. They jumped out to a 28-10 lead over TCU. And TCU did what TCU does this year, which is rallied back. They benefited from the fact that Adrian Martinez got knocked out of that game early. So Martinez didn't play against Texas. Will Howard comes out and shreds Oklahoma State with the help of Deuce Vaughn, who might be the most underrated, or I say underappreciated running back in college football this year. He is a good football player, and nobody talks about him. This is going to be a really good football game. This reminds me so much of when I was a kid, and this might be before your time, but Texas had some really quality teams. You had Michael Bishop at Kansas State. I mean, where K-State was just a really good football team. Not a lot of NFL guys, just a really good football team. Texas had the more higher ranked recruits, but they would just play some great games. This is what this game reminds me of, Ryan. I think this is going to be a really quality matchup. Texas is actually still in contention for the number two spot in the Big 12 title game, because as we talked about last week, Big 12 does not do the whole north, south, east, west division thing. Coastal Atlantic, they are 10 teams. Yes, 10 teams in the Big 12. I know. And the top 2 teams get in. That's what they've been for several years now. So obviously TCU is sitting at the top of that league right now with 0 losses. K-State is in sole possession of number 2. After that, Ryan, Oklahoma State, Baylor, and Texas all have 2 losses. So that group of 3 teams is trying to chase Kansas State for that next spot, right? Because TCU would have to lose twice to kind of get into this pickle. So this is a huge opportunity for Texas to get themselves back in the Big 12 title race because, again, their 3rd loss was out of conference. And then Kansas State, with a win over Texas, basically knocks out one of their competitors because K-State has 2 losses. One of them was out of conference. So big matchup, Ryan, in this game. Quickly give the predictions from our other staff members. Vince D'Addario predicted Kansas State to win 45-35. Sean Davis predicted Kansas State to win 31-28. Andrew McDonough, 35-31 victory for the Wildcats. And Sean Stiers predicted K-State to win 38-34. But Mr. Roberts, my man Squirrel, you went a different direction on this one.
I went a very different direction on this one. And I think that there's my biggest reason for it, Brian. Well, my biggest reasons, I guess, because there's a lot of things that kind of go into this pick for me, is that Kansas State coming off of obviously that 48-0 victory over Oklahoma State last week. Part of me says, hey, I think one of 2 things happen. You come out and you dominate the football game, which obviously the rest of the staff pretty much is predicting in this one, or you have a little bit of a letdown, right? Like come down to earth a little bit after, such a high off of a great victory, obviously last week. And then on the other side, Texas is in an interesting conversation because 2 weeks ago, they lost Oklahoma State in a 1-score game. I think it was 41-34 in that football game. And that was probably the worst game that you've seen of Quinn Ewers so far this year. I think he threw 3 interceptions in that football game. So things definitely seem to be trending in opposite directions as far as what they did last game. But I think the key part is that Texas is coming off of a bye week this past week. So they've been able to rest for a week, kind of get clearer vision after a tough loss against Oklahoma State. Kansas State, I think, is riding high off of a dramatic victory over Oklahoma State, a dominating victory. So I think that there's going to be 2 parts to this game. Texas is going to get clearer vision and kind of try to get back on track. Kansas State, I think, is going to come back down to reality a little bit after just that win against Oklahoma State. Like, I just never would have thought that they would go out there and beat them by 48 points. Yeah. Like, that was a pretty crazy admiration, right? Like, that's not a typical score that you're going to see in a match of those 2 teams. Yeah. So
it's definitely an aberration. If they played again this week, Ryan, Oklahoma State may win. It would definitely be a more competitive game. It's just one of those. It's like one of those just weird days. Yeah, it's just they had a bad day.
It's an outlier. And whenever there's an outlier, usually things flip kind of easily, right? Like at least kind of to a more narrow view, right? So I picked Texas in this football game. I think Texas comes out, and I think that Quinn Ewers is going to have a little bit of a bounce back game. I know Kansas State's been riding off of Will Howard's been actually very good the last 2 games in relief of Adrian Martinez, who had to leave 2 games ago against TCU in the first drive after the first drive of the football game. But I think also Will Howard's going to come back down to reality just a little bit, still play a solid football game. So I think Texas wins this one 34-28. Texas gets back on the right path, while Kansas State, I think, kind of comes a little bit back down to earth after that crazy victory over Oklahoma State last week.
I think they'll come back down to earth too, because they won't beat Texas 48-0. I don't think they come back down to earth in a win. And I'll be honest with you, Ryan. If Texas was playing better, I'd feel I'd feel better about this game. And the Oklahoma State game, they went on the road against Oklahoma State, and I believe Texas had a lead at one point in that game and then lost it late, if I remember correctly. So, but it's that combined with the sloppy game against Iowa State. And right now, I don't think Texas is just quite clicking. Like, I thought that the win over Oklahoma would be kind of like that springboard to okay, and they just haven't looked good since then. And you're going on the road against a really good Kansas State team. The reason that I don't think Kansas State comes down to earth to the degree that you do, number one, Kansas State's not a team that's going to consistently score 48 points. They're a 28 to 34 type of team. That's not who they are. But the shutout was the more impressive thing for me, because that's really, look, scoring 48 on Oklahoma State's not like, okay, yeah, Central Michigan scored 44 on them. You know what I mean? Texas scored 34. This is not last year's Oklahoma State team. It's the shutout that was the impressive thing. And they're not the top-ranked Big 12 defense and scoring defense. I think that's Iowa State. I think they're third in the conference in yards per game. But for my money, when I pop into the film, this is the best defense in the Big 12, in my opinion. And that's the thing that I think is repeatable. Right. That's the thing that I think you're seeing week after week after week show up for Kansas State. That's what's kind of led to their wins. They held Missouri to 12 points. Oklahoma scored 34 points. But if you go back and watch that game, Oklahoma put a couple on the board late. That game was not very close. And you talk about beating TCU 38. They gave up 38 to TCU. That was, I think, in part because you did have Adrian Martinez went down. And then Will Howard got banged up in that game as well. Then you next week 10-9 win over Iowa State. There's not a lot of teams in this year in the Big 12 that can win 10-9 games. Kansas State can. And I just think that Texas has just not been sharp. They haven't had anyone step up opposite Xavier Worthy to take the pressure off of him, which is why he hasn't been quite as dominant as I thought he would be this year. And Texas's offensive line from a run blocking standpoint has been very inconsistent. And I think they're going to have some problems against this Kansas State team when it comes to running the football. So I actually went with Kansas State. I do think it's going to be a competitive game, though. I went Kansas State 30-27. And part of that is Texas still has not shown me that they can win a close game in the fourth quarter. They haven't done it. I mean, they have yet to show me against any kind of quality opponent that they can do that. I mean, if you look at Texas's wins, Ryan, most of them are blowouts. They beat Monroe 52-10, UTSA 41-20, West Virginia 38-20, 49-0 win over Oklahoma, and then their only really competitive game late that they won was Iowa State, who's not very good. They just have not shown me that this team knows how to win games yet when it's a battle, and I expect it to be a battle. Now, could this be that week? Yes, I will not be shocked if you're right, Ryan. It's just when I look at it, I love that Kansas State defense. I like this Chris Kleiman team just has some grittiness to them, and it's a grittiness that Texas hasn't shown me they have yet. So if Texas is good, I'll say this: if Texas wins this game, it won't be close. It's going to be they come out early, they get the run game going. Quinn Ewers is hitting big shots, and Texas is just on fire, right? If it's a close, hard-fought game, I think K-State wins it at the end. Because to your point, they've played in these battles before. They've won these battles before. Texas hasn't, and so I do think that if it is a Texas win, I think it'll be a convincing Texas win. But I think the combination of quality quarterback play, no matter who plays, Will Howard or Adrian Martinez, with Deuce Vaughn making plays, and a really good defense is going to carry the day. So I'm going 30-27 Kansas State.
Can I share my admiration real quick for Deuce Vaughn? Because I agree with you 100% in the sense that he is overlooked because he's only 5'5", 175 pounds, or whatever he is. But he is a fantastic football player, dynamic, catches football in the passing game, actually gives a lot of effort as a blocker, surprisingly for a kid his size, and he's a dynamic runner. So, shout out to Deuce. He's a fantastic player.
Ryan, I got a special treat for you.
Uh-oh.
Your boy, Mr. Molinaro, has released a new video for Alabama LSU.
Are we going to play it live right now?
We are going to play it live right now. Can everybody hear this?
Saban, how are you?
Brian?
Yes, sir.
What happened to the accent?
Worry not, Coach. It still resides deep inside of me like gas pains after 3 helpings of gumbo, only to be let out when the time is certainly most appropriate. All right. I just wanted to call and wish you good luck this weekend in Death Valley and hope you caught my birthday message on Monday. It was my birthday? That's what I was told. I don't really know what day it is, all right? Could have been Easter for all I know. All right? Monday to me was just the beginning of prep week for LSU. Okay. Plus, you think I'm a guy who enjoys birthdays? Coach, congrats. You were born. What have you done for me lately? It's just another year of expectations that you got to live up to. All right? And this year, my program's already lost 1 game, and now we're expected to come in there and beat y'all by 20 and then go back to the SEC championship. Coach, I was just what? Trying to get on my good side so I come in there and ease up on y'all instead of coming into your stadium and gritting on your ass? Yeah. I saw those videos. Well, Coach, it truly has been an honor and a privilege again to speak to you. I certainly look forward.
Congratulations, you were born. What have you done for me lately? That got me, man. I was okay. That dude is a genius, man. He is a genius.
It's good. I'm going to see if I can find the video that he did with Brian Kelly and
Jimbo.
And Jimbo, yeah. I'm going to see if I can find that one here.
We're going off the rails today, man.
Yeah, that was really funny. Before we get to the rest of our predictions, that was just that one was too good. That one was too good.
That one really got me, man.
Yeah.
Congratulations, you were born. What have you done for me lately?
What have you done for me lately? And then the schizophrenic Brian Kelly, where 1 minute he's talking with the accent and the next minute he's not. That was pretty good too. So, yeah, that was really, really well done. Oh, that's good stuff. So I'm gonna have to. I'm gonna find this. We may play it. We have to play it here at some point in time. Oh, I think I found it. It's the one. It's the one that I liked was the one that he had actually of Jimbo and where Kelly gets on it. So I'm gonna play that one here real quick, and then we'll get back to breaking these down because this is just too funny.
Coach Saban, I don't know what the hell that was last night. Talk about calling the pedal black. I mean, dadgummit.
Jimbo, I don't know what you're talking about, all right? That's not how I run my program.
Oh, right. Obtain national titles and five-star recruits from sea to shining sea, but not a dime from your pocket. Sure.
Look, I don't pay these players. I just scare the living bejesus out of them so they don't go anywhere else. Plus, how else are people supposed to believe that you get these kids that commit to live in College Station?
Oh, yeah, right. Because I forgot the Tuscaloosa, the Miami Beach, Alabama.
It is if I say it is.
Look, Coach, you believe whatever you want to believe, but just know that we are coming for that ass again in 2022.
Yeah, sure. There's an 8-4 record and an appearance on the Outback Bowl. Congrats.
Dadgummit.
Whoa, now easy there, boys. Can't we all just get along like peas and carrots and mama's chicken pot pie? We are, after all, one big SEC family.
Brian, how the hell did you even get on this call?
Oh, Coach Saban, I don't know what.
How the hell did you even get on this call? Somehow got on a 3-way call.
Oh my goodness. I needed that. Okay, Ryan, let's get back to our predictions for today.
I actually cried.
Ryan, how the hell did you get on this call? Oh, okay. ACC has a big matchup this weekend, Ryan, as well. You have number 21, Wake Forest travels to number 22, NC State. Game will be at 8 o'clock on the ACC network. Wake Forest is a 4-point favorite, Ryan. A week ago, I would have predicted a very convincing Wake Forest win. I think Wake Forest, to me, was clearly going into last weekend the third best team in the ACC behind North Carolina and Clemson. Took Clemson to overtime, so they were a close third, and you could make a case that they are the second best team in the ACC. I personally would go with North Carolina, but it would be, if you were to say no, it's Wake, I wouldn't have argued with you. It was that close.
Mm-hmm.
The wheels absolutely fell off last week, Ryan.
Yep.
In a game where they lost to Louisville 48-21. And I have to say, Ryan, I've been involved in football for a very long time. Started playing football in middle school, played college football, coached college football, and have been doing this for over a decade. I've never seen anything like what I saw in the third quarter not in college. As a Bronco fan, I remember this in one of the Super Bowls, right? But in college, I've never seen this. Wake Forest had a 14-13 lead to start the third quarter. By the time the third quarter was over, it was 48-14. They had 6 turnovers in the third quarter alone. Louisville had 2 pick sixes. They had a 33-yard touchdown drive, a 9-yard touchdown drive in that quarter. And the reason that I had a little bit of a tougher time predicting this game, Ryan, I eventually went with what I went with, was because I have no clue how Wake Forest is going to respond to this mentally, to that performance. Do they bounce back, ticked off, ready to go? Is it the kind of thing that here's my thing. They're going to, they got a 5th-year quarterback and all that. There's some maturity there. Dave Claus is a good football coach. But as I'm watching that game unfold, I'm thinking, I'm having Notre Dame, Arizona State 2014 flashbacks. And Everett Golson and that Notre Dame football team never recovered from that Arizona State game. You look at who Notre Dame was going into that game and who Notre Dame became coming out of that game, they never recovered. Does Wake Forest bounce back, or does this team kind of collapse? That's, to me, what made this a challenging game to predict. I have my prediction of what I think will happen, but that made me a lot more nervous about picking this game. NC State is 6-2. They've had let's say, it's not the most impressive 6-2 in the world, Ryan. They're coming off of a 22-21 comeback win over Virginia Tech in a game they honestly should have lost. The game before that, they lost 24-9 at Syracuse. They had an ugly 19-17 win over Florida State in a game where that was more about Florida State kind of choking that game away than it was about NC State. And then, of course, a week before that, they had a convincing loss to Clemson. But they still find themselves in the top 25, Ryan. It's in Raleigh. I was back and forth on this for the last couple of days, Ryan. So what was your prediction, and how do you see this game playing out, and how do you think Wake Forest is going to respond to what happened to them last week?
I think that they're going to respond well. And you mentioned a reason that I believe that, right? You have a 5th-year quarterback that's played a lot of football in Sam Hartman. You have Dave Clawson, who's coached a lot of football at this level. You have a really veteran-laden roster just in general, like the best defensive lineman they have, Rothel Boneyard, is a 5th-year player. You have A.T. Perry, who's a senior wide receiver for them. That's a fantastic player. So I think that you have a very senior-laden team. And, I mean, I agree. Like, last week was just I have never seen anything like that either, Like, it was just wild just to kind of fall. I mean, 6 turnovers and giving up the game like that in one quarter is just wild, man. Like, there's no other word for it. It's like, it's just
8 turnovers total.
Yeah, it's just bizarre for a senior-laden team. But I think that that's what gives me hope that I do believe Wake Forest can come back for it. And I think the other part of it is that NC State has not impressed me. Like, I think that their defense is a quality defense, but offensively, I actually kind of liked what I saw from the true freshman quarterback last week in the Virginia Tech game. But, I mean, he's playing against Virginia Tech. That's not the most lethal defense in college football, right? So I think that for me, this is a game that is – I think that Wake Forest is going to have maybe a couple struggles early on against a good NC State defense, but I at the end of the day think that they just have more impact as an offensive unit just in general against a team in NC State that is struggling to move the ball consistently. So give me Wake Forest 37-28. I also don't feel great about it, but I'm going to take the senior-laden team. I'm going to take Sam Hartman against a true freshman quarterback that's probably going to be playing a lot of football, and NC State that just has not been overly impressive this year.
I think NC State's going to have a rough finish to the season, Ryan. I do. I think it's going to be a rough finish to their season. And obviously, they weren't really good on offense before Devin Leary got hurt. I mean, that's been a thing. They're 6-2 for one reason and one reason only: their defense. So you are correct. This is a really salty NC State defense. And you're referring to MJ Morris. Now, he actually is a name that some Notre Dame fans might know, or at least you may not realize you've seen film of him, but you have. He played a year with Jaden Thomas. He's from Atlanta Pace High School. So nice player coming out of high school.
Yeah.
So good football player. So at least hopefully they can say, hey, look, we found our future quarterback when Devin Leary's gone, right? So I kind of went, Ryan, in a different direction. As bad as Wake Forest defense is, you scored 22 points on Virginia Tech. You scored 9 points on Syracuse. This is just – you scored 17 on Florida State. This is just a team that doesn't score very well. And MJ's he's got some tools, but you've now got the book on him, right? Whereas Virginia Tech did not. And so I think that's going to help him. I think they're going to have a full week to prepare for him and throw different things at him. And I think it's going to be a rough performance for them. I think it's going to be a close game early. I have the final score: Wake Forest 34, NC State 17. We haven't published the predictions for this yet. Vince picked NC State to win 21-20.
Wow.
Yeah, Sean Davis picked Wake to win 27-17. Sean Stiers picked Wake to win 34-24, and Andrew McDonough picked him to win 28-17. So Vince was the outlier here. And the thing I think Vince has right, though, if that tells me he thinks NC State's defense wins the day. And that's the only chance NC State has. If they're going to win this game, it's because their defense plays lights out, and it's because Wake Forest doesn't bounce back from that loss. That's the key. That's the key.
It's a good point, because I guess if it is a little bit of an ugly game, you would give the kind of the push to NC State, right? Because I think that they are a team that could probably win uglier, right? Like, because you're talking about
Wake
somebody
can't win if their offense isn't rolling. They can't.
Right.
NC State can.
Yeah, and for as inconsistent and bad at times NC State's offenses look this year, their defense is still pretty legit, man. Like, they do have some guys. I mean, those linebackers, someone mentioned in the chat already, but like Peyton Wilson, Drake Thomas, Isaiah Moore, Shaheem Battle at corner, like they have some guys, man. They do. So it's interesting, but I hope that I am correct in this pick, so that I gain the game on Vince, so that I start to.
There you go.
I'm coming for that. I'm coming for that number one spot, man. I'm gunning for it.
A long way to go, my friend.
A little bit, but slow and steady wins the race, right? Tortoise and the hare. It taught us nothing. It taught us nothing.
My 34-17, Ryan, is Wake pulling away late. Because I do think this is a really good NC State defense, to your point. I mean, Clemson scored 30 points on them. Clemson didn't get to 400 yards of total offense in that game. I mean, they had some short fields. Clemson only had 354 yards of offense and 5.2 yards per play. They didn't lose to Clemson because of their defense. They lost to Clemson because their offense couldn't move the ball and gave them some short fields. The crazy thing about Wake Forest is, Ryan, going into last week's game, a game they had 8 turnovers. We had 5 turnovers all year coming into that. So this isn't even a team that like in 2014, Everett had some turnover issues even before. Like the game where he was brilliant against Syracuse, completed 20, but he threw 2 picks in that game. There were still some turnover issues even before. So it's not like, okay, it finally caught up to him, right? This is not a team that turns the ball over. So I'm going with you. I think they're going to bounce back. I just think it's going to take them a little bit to bounce back, because it's a combination of the mental part, going on the road, and you're playing a pretty good defense that can get after the quarterback. But I think eventually I like that. I really like Wake Forest talent at receiver. I think it's not just A.T. Perry. It's Donovan Green. I mean, they have a really nice group of receivers that even goes beyond those 2 guys. And I think that's partly what makes this Wake Forest team pretty good on offense, is that they have a lot of different weapons. Jamal Banks, Keyshawn Williams. I think they've had 3 different guys go for over 100 yards this year. I know A.T. Perry has, and I'm pretty sure that Keyshawn Williams has a 100-yard game, and Jamal Banks has a 100-yard game.
He was the kid that had 100+ against Clemson, right? The Banks kid.
Yeah. Donovan Green has not, so I was correct. 3. I knew about Williams and Banks, but I wasn't sure if Donovan, because Donovan Green's been like 2 catches for 60. 3 for 70, that kind of thing. He just hasn't had the volume to get over 100. But so that's kind of where it's at. It's a very interesting aspect to this matchup. I do think in the fourth quarter, NC State will turn the ball over a couple times, give Wake some short fields, and that's where you get the 17-point spread. So I'm going 34-17, but I think it's going to be a more tight game for a while. I just think at the end of the day, NC State doesn't have the offense to win a game like this, even at home, in my opinion. Next up, Ryan, we have a game tonight in the Pac-12. Number 23, Oregon State. I can't believe that. Jonathan Smith's doing such a great – they shouldn't be in the top 25, first of all, number one. But number two, the fact that he has them in conversation for that, 3-4 years ago when he took over, they had the worst roster in the Pac-12 by far. Yeah. He's done a great job building them up. Number 23 and 6-2 Oregon State plays at 6-2 Washington. It's going to be at 10:30 tonight on ESPN2. Washington is a 4-point favorite. Ryan, I think basically what happens here is Oregon State wins and solidifies their top 25 standing, or Washington wins and replaces them in the top 25 because they would then go to 7-2. So very interesting matchup. You have a coach in Jonathan Smith who's kind of looking to take that next step as a program. We talked about them this offseason, Ryan, and we like the job that Jonathan Smith was doing. I know you're very high on Jonathan Smith as a head coach and the job he's doing there because you're very well aware, having studied NFL film, studied film of all these teams to prepare for the NFL draft. They've had a kid here and there, but overall their talent level was pretty bad when he took over. And to see what he's done recruiting-wise, but more importantly from a development standpoint, they're coming off of a 42-9 win over Colorado State. They've won 3 in a row. They went on the road, had a great late win against Stanford, bounced back from the blowout. That was the thing for me. They bounced back from a blowout loss to Utah, bounced back, had a late win over Stanford. Then they beat Washington State by 2 touchdowns, blew out Colorado, going back on the road, where they haven't been quite as good this year. They had a tight win over Florida State or Fresno State on the road. They had a blowout loss to Utah on the road, and then they had to have a miraculous, bizarre finish at Stanford to beat Stanford on the road. So that's the interesting thing. Washington obviously went through a stretch, Ryan, where they lost 2 games in a row. Like Oregon State did, they lost at home to UCLA by 8 in a game. Ryan, you and I watched that game. That was not nearly as close as the final score. UCLA pounded them from start to finish, basically. Yep. And then they went. The bad loss was they went on the road and lost to Arizona State. Now they bounced back well, beat Arizona the next week, and then they had a gritty win over Cal last week, 28-21, in a game that, if you look at the box score and look at the how the game played out, Ryan, it was not as close as that 7-point score. So nice bounce back by Kalen DeBoer. He's trying to rebuild. He's trying to quickly rebuild Washington. It wasn't that long ago. Washington was one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the Pac-12. They were a playoff team in 2016, and they fell hard under Jimmy Lake. He actually inherited a much better roster than what Jonathan Smith inherited when he took over. And he's quickly getting him on track. He got the transfer quarterback Michael Penix. Big game for Washington to keep that momentum. Big game for Oregon State in order to solidify themselves as a top 25 team. Who do you pick in this game, Ryan? How do you think this one's going to go?
I have Oregon State in this football game, and there's a reason for this, mostly because after starting out the year a little bit up and down as a rushing team, they've really started to hit their stride over the last couple weeks. I mean, have you seen this Martinez kid, Brian, this freshman running back that they have? Man, he's a good football player. And
can I ask you this, Ryan? Where the heck do they keep finding all these running backs?
I don't know, man.
It's every year. What was it last year? It was Jefferson last year, right? Or 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
And you're like, wow, this kid's going to be pretty good. And then he goes pro for some reason, and I don't think he got drafted. And then last year, out of nowhere, BJ Baylor shows up.
Yeah.
And then this year,
years ago. Yeah.
Then this year, you got Damian Martinez stepping up as a freshman, who's got 517 yards on the season, 6.5 a carry, and five touchdowns, Ryan. But he's a kid that up until the last 2 weeks, was a backup who, 3 carries against Stanford and 5 against USC, 8 against Montana, 4 against Fresno, and then bam, back-to-back 100-yard games.
It's wild, man. Yeah, Deshaun Fenwick was their lead back, and then Martinez out of nowhere is just the guy all of a sudden, right? And he's looked good. And I think that when you kind of look at all avenues, because I've talked about Braylon Trice on the Washington defense and how good he looks. And I still think he looks fantastic. But there's just something about these two teams where I feel like there's been a lot more peaks and valleys with Washington, right? Like it's just been a little more up and down. Oregon State's been a little more consistent despite a rough loss a couple weeks ago. So I'm just going to go with the more consistent football team here, man. A team that I think is finding their identity offensively, being able to run the football because they don't have a dynamic quarterback. They don't have a dynamic passing attack. What they have is this Martinez kid's a good football player, and they still have Deshaun Fenwick, who's a bigger back as the backup too, who I think can wear down on teams a little bit too. So I think Oregon State's able to run the football in this one. I think defensively they do enough to kind of counteract Michael Penix and the passing game that Washington has. Give me Oregon State in a tough one, man. It's just something about this team that I think that they have just been a more consistent football team right now.
Agree with you 100%, Ryan. 100%. But here's to me why I'm going with Washington in this game. The inconsistency for Washington has been, are they at home? Are they on the road? That's been their inconsistency. And, last week was really their first, I would say, good road game of the year. They did not look good. I mean, their first road game of the year was at UCLA, and they got smacked. Then they go a week later, they go on the road, and they play Arizona State, and they got beat. I mean, and that was a bad loss. It's like not that far after Herm Edwards got fired. They came back home and beat a good let's say good Arizona team, a frisky Arizona team, at least offensively. Won that game, and then last week, I'm telling you what, Arizona is a really. I mean, it kind of sounds weird to say this, but they are a 3-5 team you really don't want to play. They're a team that'll battle you. But Washington bounced back, beat them at home, and then went on the road and had their first decent road game of the year in beating Cal. Come back home. If this was at Oregon State, I think Oregon State would win. The fact that it's at Washington and Washington seems to play better at home is kind of the reason for it. Now, the interesting thing about this matchup, though, Ryan, is Washington is a passing team. Their run game is a complement of their passing attack. Their backfield is not great. They're a team they're not a very good running team. Mm-hmm. They're a team that likes to throw the football.
Yep.
The interesting thing about Oregon State, however, is Oregon State, the way to beat them is not to throw the football. They have a pretty good throwing defense. They did a really nice job keeping USC in check. They've held USC to 180 yards, held Utah to 199 yards. Stanford threw for some. They had some chunk plays. They've given up a little bit more ground lately, just yardage-wise. But their overall play, they gave up 345 yards passing to Washington State. That's all 54 attempts, right? You know what I mean? Like they had to throw a ball a lot to get there. And the same thing last week against Colorado. Colorado had 206 yards, but that was on 29 attempts. Mm-hmm. So I really like the Oregon State pass defense. And that's really, I mean, they have a really, really salty pass defense and a big, and the thing is, they're not a high pressure team. Like they don't rack up a lot of sacks. They only have 12 sacks on the year, and half of them came against Washington State. But they're secondary. I don't know what you think of them, Ryan, from an NFL draft standpoint. I haven't popped on the all 22 yet. When I watch them live, I'm like, man, these kids are just on people, just constantly around the ball. I really like this Washington State team. So I think, or Oregon State secondary. So I think Washington wins because I think Washington has just the better athletes and they're at home. But I think this is going to be a competitive football game, and I would not be shocked if Oregon State's able to make Washington one-dimensional and force some turnovers and win this game. I wouldn't be shocked by it, but I think being at home, having the better athletes on the perimeter, I think this is a game that Washington wins. But I think it's going to be a very, very fun game to watch, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, Oregon State has a couple defensive backs, to your point, Brian, that are definitely on my radar. I mean, they have Rajon Wright, who, if people remember that name, he was on Last Chance U. He was at Laney Junior College. His older brother was Nashawn Wright, who was drafted by the Dallas Cowboys a couple years ago in the third round. So they have a couple of those guys, man, where you're just like, they have 6'2" guys with long arms in the secondary, which is very, very intriguing. So this is going to be, we talk about like a money game, right? Like for the Oregon State secondary going against guys like Jalen McMillan and the Romeo Andunzo kid and those types of players. This is a big opportunity for them, right? So, I mean, I'll be tuning in tonight just because I think it's a fun prospect matchup. I think it's going to be a really interesting football game to watch because, to your point, Jonathan Smith has taken steps. Is he going to take another massive step here? Is Washington going to kind of, business as usual at home for what we've seen this season? It's going to be an interesting game. And then Michael Penix has had a really nice bounce back year after the terrible year that he had and the Indiana program had just in general last year. So it's going to be a really interesting game to watch.
I'll say something else, Ryan. If you are correct and Oregon State can go on the road and get this win, they've got a really good chance to be a 10-win team this year, bowl game included, because if they win this game, that puts them at 7-2. They have Cal at home next week, which is a game they can win. They go at Arizona State, a game they can win. Now, both of those games are not gimmies by any stretch, but they're games they can win. And then they finish the year against Oregon at home. Now, if you assume that they're going to lose that game, that puts them at 9-3. You're a bowl game away from being a 10-win team. Like, if Jonathan Smith has his team at 9-3 at the end of the year, he's in the coach of the year conversation for me. You know, and so I think he's doing a really, really good job. This is a big win game for him. And the same thing is true for Washington too, Ryan, is, you look at what they got coming up. I actually think they really need this win because they play Oregon State at home. Their next game is at Oregon. They also have a road game at Washington State left on the board. So they need this win if they're going to keep building on the momentum that they currently have.
And the great thing about what Jonathan Smith is doing too, Brian, is the fact of he's going to probably be a guy with what he's doing at Oregon State that a lot of teams are going to start to come after. But he's an Oregon State grad, and he strikes me as one of those guys that is just going to be happy building the Oregon State program up because that's his alma mater, right? Like that's where that's home. That's where he's loved. So I hope Jonathan Smith sticks around in Oregon State for a few years here, man, because I do think that he has a chance to build something that Oregon State hasn't had in a little bit. Yeah. And Mike Riley had a couple nice years. Obviously he did a pretty good job, but Oregon State was down for a while there. And it's really a cool story just to see one of their own come back and Jonathan Smith and get them back to this point where they're a good program.
Yep. Ryan, we're going to hustle through some of these next games as we finish this thing up. I want to get your thoughts just briefly on a few games here. SEC game, Florida at Texas A&M. It's going to be at noon on ESPN. Texas A&M is a 3-point favorite. This is a big game for both teams. Florida needs to rally and get back on track. I don't care if it's your first year or not. Gator alums and fans are not overly patient. Billy, you start the year off with that really big win over Utah, got you a little bit of a grace period. You got smacked last week by Georgia. You're 4-4. The schedule is not exactly a cakewalk to kind of rally back and get back on track. When you look at what Florida kind of has coming down the pike, they still have to play South Carolina. They got to play at Florida State. This is a big one. And then, of course, A&M is just fighting for their salvation as a team, for their survival as a team, 3-5. The schedule does not get any easier. If they lose at home to Florida, they got to go to Auburn, which right now is not a gimme. Game at home against UMass is a win, and then they got LSU at home. Right? I mean, they can only afford one more loss and be a bowl team. So preseason top 10 teams fighting for their bowl lives right now. How do you see? I mean, quickly, what are your thoughts on this game? How do you see it playing out?
Brian, I think that this Texas A&M team has kind of given up on Jimbo, man. Like that's kind of what I see. And it's funny, like even when Florida loses to a Georgia the way they did, I didn't really think that Florida gave up on Billy Napier in that game.
With LSU.
Right? Like
Same with the LSU loss.
I just feel like it's just their dudes are kind of better than your dudes, and you're trying to figure it out right now, right? And it's obviously not good enough. Florida needs to keep building that program recruiting wise. Like I know they have a pretty good class as of right now in the 2023 cycle, and they just need to keep building because I think there's a talent issue in Gainesville right now. But either way, I haven't really looked at a Billy Napier team any week and been like, that team quit on him, right? Yep. Texas A&M, I can't say the same. I can't. I think we've talked about this almost every week, but the panic meter has to be at a 10 if Texas A&M loses this football game, man. Like, at what point do you just say, like, guys, this isn't working? Now you're getting players suspended during, before football games now, and just
for things that I mean, that's a lack of institutional control type of thing, for what they were allegedly suspended for. Yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, it's not great, man. It's not great. So I think that I just think Florida is going to be a little bit more up for this football game compared to where Texas A&M is. I think that Jimbo may have lost his team. So give me Florida, although I don't feel great about it just because both teams aren't very good. But I feel better about Florida playing for Billy Napier than I do for Texas A&M playing for Jimbo Fisher right now. That's just where I'm at with it.
Yep. Agree. Baylor at Oklahoma, 3:00 game, ESPN Plus. Oklahoma is a 3.5-point favorite. Ryan, this is a very intriguing game for me. Oklahoma is a team that looked to be dead. It looked to me what you had just mentioned about A&M. They had quit on Brent Venables. There was a report that he kind of went in there and laid in his team and basically said, if you don't want to be here, leave. Good. They bounced back with a convincing win over Kansas that next week. They had a bye in between Kansas and Iowa State, went on the road and beat Iowa State. No, I said Kansas State. I meant Iowa State. Beat Iowa State convincingly. They got Baylor at home this week. They're 5-3. A win over home against Baylor. You've got at West Virginia, at Texas Tech left on your schedule, sandwiched in between the Bedlam series, which is a home game against Oklahoma State. There's a chance that if you can beat Baylor this weekend, that Oklahoma State could finish the season much like Notre Dame on a very strong note, right? And so, but we're going to find out who they really are right now because Kansas was playing without Daniels for the first time, and then of course we've talked about this. Iowa State's just not very good this year. They're pretty. Yeah. They're probably right now, to me, the second worst or worst team in the Big 12 this year, in my opinion, with them in West Virginia right now. Yeah. So this is going to be a big game. Baylor looked really good last week against Texas Tech. Dave Aranda has this team playing better than they should be playing. I mean, with all the guys they lost, and they're a competitive 5-3 right now. Thought they would beat Texas Tech last week, Ryan, but I didn't think it would be the way that they beat Texas Tech last week. I mean, Texas Tech has been a very game team this year. They're not a team that you just smack around, and Baylor smacked them around. And that came after a convincing win over Kansas. So, and then they've got Kansas State, TCU, and Texas to finish the season. So right now you're feeling really good about the job he's done. It could quickly turn into not feeling good about it these next 4 games, and it starts this weekend. I'm really curious to see how Oklahoma does against a defense this physical. Yeah. And that's going to be the really interesting part. What do you see about this game, Ryan? Who do you have in this game? I'm actually going with Baylor in this game.
So, Brian, I'm struggling with this game a little bit, man. Like, there's just some games where you just have a gut feeling, but you can't really explain why your gut feels that way, right? Like, there's something about this game that I look at and I just think Oklahoma's going to win. I don't know exactly what it is. I feel like when they have Dylan Gabriel, they've looked a whole lot better offensively than when they don't, obviously, right? And I do really like that Brent Venables kind of laid into this team, and they haven't quit on him, which is awesome to see. At the end of the day, although I think that Oklahoma still needs to get a lot more talented in certain areas of their team, I just think that they may have better athletes than what Baylor has right now, right? Like Baylor's definitely better coached right now. They're definitely a more physical team, but Oklahoma just strikes me as that team that's just going to, just put up some points just because they have some guys still at wide receiver like Marvin Mims of the world and Eric Gray in the backfield and those types of guys, right? So give me Oklahoma in this game, but I would be completely lying if I said that I felt good about it. Like this is just one of those games where there's a gut feeling, and I guess I'm just going to trust my gut on it because I don't obviously have a rooting interest in the game.
Right. I have a rooting interest because I really like what I really like Dave Aranda. And it's not an anti-Oklahoma thing at all. I don't have anything against Brent Venables. I don't have anything against Oklahoma. At least nothing I'm going to share. I just really like I feel like he's doing it the right way, right? Toughness.
I love
coaching,
Dave Aranda.
All those type of things. It's play the game the right way, not gimmicky at all. We're going to line up and we're going to fight you for 60 minutes. I just love the team that he's building and the way that he was doing it. So I like what they're doing. So I'm going to go with Baylor. I just want to see how Oklahoma does against a team that can play defense. We'll see. The question then is, does Baylor have enough offense to win this game? That's going to be, at the end of the day, the problem. Next game, Ryan, Syracuse at Pitt. Syracuse is still number 20 in the rankings after their loss to Notre Dame, 3:30 game on ACC Network. Pitt is a 4-point favorite, Ryan, which I'll be honest with you. I was a little surprised by that, to be completely honest with you, to see that they were a favorite when you look at kind of how Pitt's played lately, which is not well. They look like they were going to battle North Carolina for a while, And then there was a stretch in the second half where it went from a 24-21 lead to a 42-24 deficit. This came after a 2-touchdown loss to Louisville. They've lost 3 out of 4, including a home game to Georgia Tech. They're home against Syracuse. I think maybe they're banking on Syracuse as being beat up. I think maybe that's what they're saying. And they are pretty beat up. So Syracuse has a chance to bounce back against a struggling Pitt team. Both of these teams are kind of coming in as wounded animals, Ryan. I'm very curious to see which team is able to bounce back and get to that point in time.
I liked a lot of what I saw from the backup quarterback for Syracuse, Carlos Del Rio Wilson, last week. And I think that if he is, the guy this week with Garrett Schrader banged up, I think that offense can still do enough against Pitt because, Pitt's offense has just been so inconsistent, man. And the running game I know has been pretty good. Israel Abakinda has been a good football player this year, but the passing attack has just not been there. Keaton Slovis has been very inconsistent. The wide receivers have not been great, except for a couple deep shots down the field this year. So I think for me, I'm going to take Syracuse because I do think Syracuse is playing a good brand of football for the most part this year. They've played physical brands, and I think that Pittsburgh is a very one-dimensional team right now. So I think Syracuse is going to have their emphasis to hey, let's stop the run. Let's force Keaton Slovis and the Pittsburgh passing attack to try to beat us. And offensively, I think they have enough firepower with Sean Tucker still healthy, with Arondé Gadsden, and whether it is Garrett Schrader or it's Carlos Del Rio, I do think that they'll have enough for the offense wise. So give me Syracuse. I think Pitt's a tough team, but I just think that Syracuse has more offensive firepower than Pitt that I can depend on.
Yeah, I would like to see Syracuse win this game. That's who I'm kind of going for in this game. It's just, can they run the football? Pitt's got a weird defense. Their run defense some weeks looks phenomenal, and other weeks is like, what the heck? Like, they gave up 232 yards to Georgia Tech, 190 West Virginia. Other than that, 91 to Tennessee, 50, 63, 86 to North Carolina, 122 and 126. It's very Jekyll and Hyde. But their quarterbacks are going to need to make some plays in this game. There's no doubt about that. Next game, Ryan, Florida State at Miami. Florida State's playing Miami, and no one's talking about it.
No one cares.
And a lot of that has to do with Miami. They're really struggling this year. They have looked really bad at times. Has not been a great start to Mario Cristobal's tenure. And honestly, they have underachieved relative to their talent level. Now, they didn't have a great talent, but I'm sorry, they have better talent than Duke. And they got smashed by Duke. They have better talent than Middle Tennessee State. And they got smacked by Middle Tennessee State and barely beat a bad Virginia team in one of the ugliest games I have ever seen in my entire life. Miami's struggling. I'll be honest with you, though. Florida State has not exactly lit the world on fire in recent games either. Here's what I'm questioning. They looked great starting off 4-0 and then had 3 pretty ugly losses. They bounced back in really impressive form last week against Georgia Tech. Does Florida State keep that rolling and kind of add to Miami's misery, or is Miami able to salvage their season, get it back on track, and pull off the upset over Florida State? Florida State is a 7.5-point road favorite at Miami.
Yeah. Well, I think this, Brian, I would not take that 7.5 points, right? Like I do think that Florida State will win this football game. And it says a lot more about Miami than it does about Florida State. Because you're right, Florida State has been an up and down team this year. But I think that you can rely more on what Jordan Travis has shown you, what Johnny Wilson at wide receiver has shown you, and the spurts of what Jared Verse has played defensively over what I've seen from Miami in recent weeks, man. Like, they just are not a good football team right now. I know that Tyler Van Dyke's kind of gotten beat up as well. So Jake Garcia played last week and did not look very good in that football game against Virginia. It's just right now, Miami is struggling. They are struggling. I think that there's some positions that just have a lack of talent. I think that otherwise though, Mario Cristobal and his staff is just trying to figure out what works for this team. So give me Florida State just because I feel a little bit better about what their key players are right now. And I just, again, it says more about where I think Miami is than where I think Florida State is right now.
Agree. Ryan, one of our questions that we had in here was about there's a couple other games that Brandon Plensner wanted to ask us about, and I'm going to find those here real quick. Some of those we've addressed. We talked about Baylor, Oklahoma. We talked about Florida A&M. Here's a couple more that just quickly, Arkansas at Liberty. Ryan, I have not seen Liberty at all this year. I don't know if you have or not, so I really don't have an opinion on that game.
Very sporadically.
I've looked at their resume, and I'm impressed by it. They're 7-1, and their only loss was to Wake Forest by a point. But I have a hard time seeing Liberty win that game just on paper, but I mean, I haven't seen enough of them this year.
You got to think that Raheem Sanders and that running game kind of wear down on Liberty a little bit, right? Like, again, I haven't watched enough Liberty to be like a fully educated opinion on it, Brandon, but I would say, SEC team versus, what is Liberty? Are they a Sunbelt team at this point? I believe
they're an independent right now.
Oh, they're independent right now.
Still, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, they will be moving. I believe they're moving to the Sun Belt. I believe, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
Okay. Well, all I know is that although Arkansas has been an up and down team this year, Brian, one thing that you have depended on them is that Raheem Rocket Sanders is a dude at running back, right? So I just think wearing down on that defense a little bit. It's a little bit of an undersized defense. I know that for a fact. I mean, their best defensive end is 240 pounds, like 6'2", right? So it's a little bit of an undersized defense. Give me Raheem Sanders to wear him down. But again, haven't seen enough of the offense for Liberty to have an educated opinion on them.
Same here. Texas Tech at TCU. I don't think Texas Tech has the firepower to beat TCU. They're a tough team. They play hard. I love how Joe McGuire has a team playing. Honestly, last week, Ryan, the game just got away from them. They have had just week after week after week. They're playing in battles, and I just think they hit a wall. I think they're better than what they showed last week. They just don't have the horses to beat TCU, in my opinion. I agree. I'm assuming you agree with that. 100%. BYU at Boise State. It depends on what. Who is BYU now at this point in time?
Give me BYU in that game. Give me BYU.
You think they're going to bounce? I picked them to. I picked them in our IB Pick'em League. I picked BYU. I took the points basically. I don't. It's not picking them out right. It's a big spread. It's a big spread.
That was almost my upset pick of the week because I actually watched a little bit of Boise. They have a really nice freshman quarterback named Taylon Green who's actually doing a pretty nice job. Kind of a dual threat kid, but. There's just, I don't know. I just watch every time I watch Boise State, I just don't think they're that good of a team, right? So I think that BYU has more talent than them. It's crazy.
The problem is you're talking about BYU. They just, who are they? I mean, I feel like the back-to-back against Notre Dame and Arkansas really wore them out. Then they went on the road, got blown out by Liberty, came back home last week. You think they're going to recover against ECU, and they get beat by ECU. So they're either going to collapse or they bounce back. Obviously, the only two options. I just don't know what to make of BYU at this point in time.
That's fair.
I really don't.
It's very fair.
Don't. Well, we'll get to just a couple quick questions here, just from some folks. Here's an interesting one from Brandon Plensner. Is this the game where Tommy Rees proves his value or signs his death warrant? And it's a little bit – I don't like the phrase, but honestly, if the offense lays an egg in this game, I just don't think Coach Rees can recover from that. Reputation-wise, no matter what. I mean, if they go out and they score on Navy, BC, and USC, the response is, well, none of those teams can play any kind of defense at all, right? This is your chance to kind of do something against a really good team, and salvage your season. And I think this is a game that could prove his value. Now he has to follow that up, but I think this game could be the beginning of it. I don't know if it's something that necessarily proves his value and fully, but I do think it could be the beginning of the end if they look like they have offensively in the last month, then I think this could be a tough one.
I think you labeled it perfectly yesterday, Brian. Like this could be the trend toward changing the narrative, right? But it's not going to change the narrative just based upon one football game, or it could be the end, right? Like there's not too much, it could go downhill very quickly. And if it's going to go uphill, though, it's going to be kind of an exponential, you got to stack games type of thing.
And you look back and say, this is when it started.
Exactly.
That's what you would do is you'd look back at this game and say, this is when it started. Agree completely. We'll just get a couple more here, Ryan. We're not going to get to too many of these because we've gone really long and we've got Ryan's got a lot of phone calls to make and I've got to get some things ready here too. Jonathan Gabrick says, this is a good question, Ryan. He says, because I have an opinion on this. I'm going to share mine, and then I want to hear what you have to say on it. Okay. Jonathan Gabrick says, does this year give an even stronger argument for 12-team playoff, especially with the conference alignment of 4 of the top 5 teams? To me, Ryan, the opposite is true. This is the year that shows there's no reason to expand to 12 teams. LSU is sitting there at 10 with 2 losses. A blowout loss. I mean, they are so far removed from the top teams. In my opinion, there's a huge gap between 1, 2, and 3 and 4. right? I think Clemson's 4. There's a big gap between Ohio State, Georgia, and Tennessee and Clemson, right? And so to me, this is the year that shows why are we doing 12 teams? There are not anywhere close to 12 teams that are championship caliber football teams. Now, the furthest I could go with this is 8.
18,
this year might show why there's an 8, because 8 this year could beat 1. If you look at getting a UCLA or an Oregon in, that kind of team, that kind of team in. But you go past that, and it's like, no. I mean, you're talking about Ole Miss would be in right now. Tulane would be in right now. Who wants to watch that? Who wants to watch Ole Miss go getting just curb stomped by somebody in the first round of the playoff? Who wants to go watch LSU go in and get murdered by somebody in the first round of the playoff with 3 losses on this, something like that. So, this year's the opposite, Ryan, in my opinion. What's your take?
8's the number. I've been on this bandwagon for a few years for me, right? Like, there are going to be some years like this one where there isn't maybe a great team. Like, Tennessee looks like that team, but like that could change. That opinion could change very quickly, right? Like, how many elite teams are in college football this year? I do think that there's kind of like a second group of teams that are pretty close together this year. I know. I see it. 0. I see it.
0.
But I do think, Brian, that there is some merit to an 8-team playoff. I really do. Because I do think, in a lot of years, I don't think it's just like 1 or 2 years. Like, in a lot of years, there is like a second group that's there's like a lack of separation between these teams, right? Like, there's a little bit of a middle ground. So I'd be okay with 8. I agree, though. 12 is way too much. I mean, to your point.
I don't even like 8, because I don't think there's ever been a year where 8 teams were championship caliber. Never. Now, the most I've ever said is 6.
Fair.
The most, there was a year where I thought, was it 2018 when Ohio State didn't get in at 13-1, and I think it was it Oklahoma? No, Oklahoma. Georgia didn't get in, and Georgia had 2 losses that year, but they were a pretty good team that year. And then after that, it was over. I will still contend that the best way to do it is the format that I've proposed in the past. Give me the bowl games back. Give me the traditional bowl games back, and pick your 4 after the bowl games. That's what I would like to see back. Let these teams play each other out of conference, see who does it. Because now you're 7, you can have a chance to prove you belong in the top 4. So if you're the number 7 team, if things fall your way, you could go from 7 to 4 or 5 to 2. Those are the things I'd like to see, where then we find out, okay, is there more than 4 teams? But so you're expanding the playoff without necessarily expanding the playoff. That's still the best way. And then pick your 4 after that is what I would do. So there's that would be the way that I would go with it. So, but no, 12 is fun. It's all that, but like people say, well, that means more teams can say they made the playoff. No, because all it does is cheapen what being a playoff team means. It's like, name me a Power 5 conference that their basketball coach gets a raise for consistently going into the NCAA tournament and getting knocked out in the first round. Right. Well, you made the NCAA tournament. Well, now there's 68 teams. Nobody cares anymore. This isn't like back in the day, like when Digger Phelps was coaching and they beat UCLA. There's only 32 teams at the most made the NCAA basketball tournament. Now that's when you can brag about it. So now it's like, if you're not going to the Sweet 16, you're not really having a successful year. If you're at a big time school, eventually it's going to be like, well, okay, yeah, you're the 12 seed. Who cares? You know what I mean? So I don't care.
College basketball is wild, man. It's like, oh man, we made the NCAA tournament. It's like 64 teams made NCAA.
There's 68 now, Ryan. It's 68 now because you have the 4 play-in games.
Yeah, good point. I forgot about those. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nuts.
It's wild, man.
Nuts. But wild. I mean, Jonathan, I get where you're coming from. I just kind of see it differently. I see it differently. We got a couple super chats, here's one I want to get to before we get to the super chats at the end, Ryan. Jeff Fluke with a good question. Do you think this Tennessee team will be able to sustain the winning way, or will they be like LSU and have a new coach in 3 years? I want to get your thoughts on that, Ryan.
I think it's going to be able to sustain it, because what I think that they're doing really well is that they're recruiting at a very high level. And I just believe in this coach more than a couple coaches that LSU has had. Like they've won, like Ed Orgeron put together 1 Grays a year, right? Like I just think that what I've seen of Josh Heupel, I think that there's a level of belief that I have in him as a coach at 1, and that I also think that he's going to recruit at a very high level. And then, like, hey, let's be honest about it, right? Tennessee has a lot going for them in the NIL department. They have a lot going for them in the cell, in Nashville, all that type of stuff, right? Like, I think it's going to be a desirable place for a lot of talented players to go. And I just have a lot more belief in Josh Heupel than I did about a couple LSU coaches.
To your point on that one, Ryan,
Mm-hmm.
the one difference is when LSU had that 1 year, they had to go away from what their coach believes in.
Yeah.
And Tennessee's winning with doing what this coach was brought in to do. And that's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Auburn is another example with Gene Chizik, where he won a title and then 2 years later he's fired. Again, he was a defensive coach that just happened to get a generational quarterback. I think that Hendon Hooker's a phenomenal player right now, but he's not a generational talent.
Sure.
You know, so it's a lot of, I mean, he's the perfect guy for that system, but it's not like they went and got Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson and just rode them like Clemson did. It's a lot of stuff that you look and say, you can repeat that. I mean, Jalen Hyatt's a good football player. He's not Devontae Smith. The system is creating that a lot. You know what I mean? Cedric Tillman's a good football player.
Yes.
He's not
He's
Garrett Wilson,
also
right?
He's a fifth-year senior. Like, there's a reason that he's been in college for 5 years comparative. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Because he's not an elite talent. So you start getting the players that have that ability as long as here's my only fear. Can Josh Heupel manage the personalities the way that they're recruiting? That's the concern. Because what I feel like you have now is you'll have a lot of kids who like fit, you know, Hendon Hooker overlooked for crew. You know, Jalen Hyatt was a top 4-star, top 200 kid, but he wasn't like an elite 5-star getting big NIL deals out of high school. Right. Same with Cedric Tillman. Those guys are good football players. They weren't like bum recruits, but they were guys. They're hungry. They have a chip on their shoulder. Can he sustain this with the kids they're going out and buying? That's the big question that I have. It's not about. I like the scheme. I like the way he's running it. They play discipline. Like, they're a very well coached team. It's, can you manage the personalities as you get bigger names into your program? That's going to be the question.
What I find really interesting about it too, Brian, is like you mentioned it, right? Hendon Hooker, I think, is a really, really good football player. Not an elite talent, though. Cedric Tillman's not an elite talent. He's doing a lot with good talents right now. Like, I don't think that this team is as talented as it can be in the next couple of years, right? Like, their offensive line, I mean, their right tackle is a pretty solid football player. Otherwise, not a ton of talent up front. Defensive line-wise, they have a couple good defensive ends, but it's not like thorough as far as like, on paper, they should not be as good as Alabama or Georgia are right now. And that's what gives me hope for Josh Heupel, is the fact that talent is only going to get better in Knoxville right now. And if it gets better with the coaching that he's doing, you have to think that it's going to look pretty darn good here moving forward. So that's part of the reason that I'm like, okay, I can buy into that a little bit. Like, sustainability, I think, is there.
Yep. Agree. We have a super chat from John Long. I'm not quite sure what this means, Ryan, but John Long left a super chat. He said, did he just call someone else Rocket?
I know what it is.
No, my friend.
Yeah, it was for Raheem Sanders, the running back for Arkansas. His nickname is also Rocket. I'm sorry, John.
Gotcha.
Okay, I didn't give him the nickname.
He didn't name him. There's only one Rocket, baby.
Yeah.
Kirsten Paul with a super sticker. Thank you very much. And then Brandon gave a super chat at the end. Brandon, thank you very much. 2 quick Big Ten games, Ryan. Purdue at Iowa. We'll do that one first, then Maryland and Wisconsin. So let's talk Purdue at Iowa. I think Iowa can keep Purdue's points down, but you could keep Purdue to 13 points and still lose.
Yes. I mean, that's point blank, man. At the end of the day, like, even if Purdue's offense struggles a little bit, I mean, Aiden O'Connell just needs to put together a couple of drives, right? And you're probably in a decent spot.
I just need 2 touchdowns, bro. That's all we need. Just give me 2. Just give me 2, baby, and we can get this dub. There's no doubt.
And Purdue's defense has played pretty well this year, Brian, for the most part, right? So, give me Purdue in that one. Give me Purdue.
Yeah, I like that one as well. Maryland, Wisconsin is an interesting one because I feel like the Maryland hype train is back in effect. You know, now that they've won a couple games, it's like everybody's just jumping on the, Wisconsin. I'm sorry, I said Maryland. I meant Wisconsin. The Wisconsin hype train is back. You know, they are the most overhyped team in the country every year recently. I said it last year. They weren't going to be as good as people thought. I said it this year. They weren't going to be as good as people thought. Still might win the West, but it would be ugly. They're sitting there at 4-4. It's kind of like they went out and blew out Northwestern, and then all of a sudden the next week everyone's predicting them to beat Michigan State on the road, and I was like, nope, not happening. And they lost to Michigan State. Guess what? Michigan State stinks, right? Now here's the thing: they had a very nice win over Purdue last week, really nice win, and that was like the worst thing that could happen to Wisconsin when it comes to the Wisconsin hype train. that they actually, looked good in a game that they actually won. It was a down game for Purdue, obviously defensively, but they're now at home again against Maryland, who is a surprising 6-2 football team. And one of their losses was a really hard-fought game against Michigan. I thought they battled Michigan really well that game. Their other loss was a 2-point home loss to Purdue, a game they honestly should have won, Ryan. So Maryland is a better football team. Wisconsin has won, 2 out of their last 3, right? 3 out of their last 4, I believe. No, I'm sorry. That's Maryland. Maryland has won 3 of the last 4. Wisconsin has won 2 of their last 3, so I was correct. So, Ryan, how do you see this one playing out? I think Wisconsin's at home. I think that's kind of that's how I made my prediction. Who's at home? Wisconsin? Give me Wisconsin.
Yeah, give me Wisconsin in this one, and it's mostly just this says more again about Maryland than Wisconsin. Like you said, Maryland's sitting at 6-2, like they're on a pretty good spot. But I feel like Maryland always does this, man, where they're like, "Oh wow, Maryland's trended up," and then they lay a goose egg against someone where you're just like, "Oh, they're not back yet," right? That's Maryland in a nutshell under Mike Loxley. So give me Wisconsin. I don't know why. There's no big reason. It's just I can't trust Maryland.
They're at home.
That's all it is.
I don't trust either one of these two teams, so I went with the home team. I'm right there with you, Ryan. Right there with you. Somebody said I think we broke Wisconsin last year. Yeah, to a degree, but they were that team. We talked about that before the year. They were not that team that everybody thought they were. I'm going to just respond to this real quick from Jordan Zrabic. Jordan said, I think I'm saying that right. Maybe it's Grabic. I see Notre Dame offered the wide receiver who decommitted from Texas Tech. Did coach bring up Lions at all in the stream if he's trending away, if we made another offer, or just recruiting safety net? For me, honestly, Jordan, we've talked a little bit about this. This is the thing that's more on the message board. I will simply say this. Notre Dame's offer to him is not something that was in response to his decommitment. This has been something that was sort of contingent upon his decommitment. And so he is visiting this weekend. There's been back and forth debate on, him decommitting and going, being public with it. So that way Notre Dame can bring him in an unofficial. We had reported that he was going to make it an unofficial. That's what he had kind of told Notre Dame. The staff really has been working to try to make it an official, which meant he had to decommit. And that's what he has done. We'll kind of leave it at that, right? Because we want you to go join the message board, but we'll have an update here in a little bit about how we see this playing out. But I did put something on the board also, Ryan, about what it would mean if he decommits before the visit. So you'll want to check that out a little bit. But I like where Notre Dame is at. I also wanted to respond to some folks that were saying that that Tayshawn Lyons moved on from Notre Dame. It's the other way around. So we'll just kind of leave it at that and go from there. But that's kind of what we'll say here, Jordan. So everybody, thank you so much for being with us today. This was a fun show, Ryan. I enjoyed it. Got to learn that your name is Squirrel now. Very much thoroughly enjoyed that. So, and then we'll be, and again, please stop talking about things that Rivals says, right? Rivals says, just stop. I don't want to hear what Rivals reports.
Brian, did you hear that Rivals said Brendan Vernon's going to decommit? It's crazy, man. Crazy.
Yeah. Stop talking to me about what Rivals says. Ryan's obviously being sarcastic there for people who can't see, who are listening to the podcast, who can't see the look on his face. He's being sarcastic. So anyway, Ryan, that is going to do it for today's show. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Vince and Sean Stiers are back for IB Nation Countdown to Kickoff. You'll definitely want to check that out. They'll have everything you need to know about the Notre Dame game tomorrow night. We will be tailgating tomorrow. We'll probably start between like around 1 and 2 is when we're going to be there. We're going to be in the stadium lot. We'll have food. I'm going to be there. Vince is going to be there. We're going to look for us, right? And when we get set up, I'll send out a picture on Twitter and I'll put it on the message board of kind of where we are. Come find us if you're on campus tomorrow. You do not have to be an IB message board member to be at the tailgate. There is no fee. There's no donation. We don't charge you. Look, we've said this before. If you're a part of this community, whether it's a paying member on the message board or someone who watches the show regularly, you're a part of the Irish Breakdown community, right? And you're helping us build our business, whether you're giving direct money or not, okay? You're a part of our community. And when we have things like this, you're welcome. Friends are welcome. Your friends are welcome. Your family are welcome, all that kind of stuff. We'd love to meet all of you. at that tomorrow. So we will be tailgating tomorrow before the Clemson game. So for Ryan, I'm Brian. Hit the like button, folks. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notification bell. Share this podcast. Check out the merch store. Sign up for the message board at the bottom. If you're listening via podcast, give us a 5-star review. We would greatly appreciate that. And, of course, have a great day. And we'll talk to you again very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.